Hello, welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. Today's episode, I'd like you to keep in the back of your mind today that some of the earlier French buccaneers, Francois l'Olonnais and his crew, for example, they were alive when this story took place, most of it. Some of them were living in France when this story took place. Now, France was the most populous nation in Europe, so most of them probably didn't see this take place as it's fairly localized in and around Paris and Orléans, but this would have shaped their worldview. It would have been something that was a formative political experience for them. That's the reason why I think it's necessary from time to time to talk about the history of the world surrounding the pirates. However, as you may have noticed, I always struggle with just how much to talk about that stuff. Sometimes I'll give just a brief outline of major events, and other times I'll go way overboard. For example, we never really talked much about the Franco-Dutch War. On the other hand, when we talked about the Glorious Revolution in England, which we aren't even really done with yet, I went way into it. And when we talk about the War of the Spanish Succession, we're going to go into great detail because we have to understand the Nassau pirates. Similarly, today, we're going to begin our look at the 9 Years' War of 1688 to 1697. It's also known as the War of the League of Augsburg, or the War of the Grand Alliance, and it was a big war. It encompasses a ton of tertiary conflicts that are going to involve and impact the pirates. So we're going into detail. Now, we're not going to do a battle-by-battle breakdown of the war, although there will be some of that. Instead, I'm going to focus on the personalities and the politics that made this war happen and made it what it was. And when we're talking about the personalities that molded the early modern world and the 9 Years' War, there's really only one name. This is episode 145, Before the Dawn. The historian Will Durant wrote of King Louis XIV of France, quote, "The most famous of French kings was only 1/4 French. He was half Spanish by his mother, Anne of Austria, 1/4 Italian by his grandmother, Marie de Médicis. He took to Italian art and love, afterward to Spanish piety and pride. In his later years he resembled his maternal grandfather, Philip III of Spain, far more than his paternal grandfather, Henry IV of France." End quote. And that's actually a reasonable place to begin the story of Louis XIV. I could take this back to Charlemagne and Hugh Capet. In fact, I may have had an outline written out to that effect, but I'm not going to do so. Instead, the grandfather of Louis XIV, Henry IV of France. And we've talked about him, you probably remember him. The Bourbon king of Navarre who married into the ruling Valois family of France. But of course that turned out to be a ploy by Catherine de' Medici, allegedly to lure a bunch of Protestants into Paris where they would be mercilessly massacred in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. The very same Henry Bourbon that escaped captivity and returned to Paris at the head of a Huguenot army. And after all of the other males in line for the throne were killed, or some of them, at least one of them, assassinated by Henry, Henry IV ascended the throne and became the first Bourbon king of France. As you can imagine, even though Henry eventually converted to Catholicism, the Vatican wasn't happy with this state of affairs. They didn't like Henry, and they didn't really care for the Bourbons. There was a schism between Paris and Rome that ran back for centuries, but Henry IV, just being on the throne, made things worse. The point is, though, even though Henry had annulled his marriage to his first Valois wife, and Catherine de' Medici was dead, so Henry was the sole power in Paris, he married another Medici woman, who was the daughter of his largest financial backer. Her name was Maria de' Medici, and they had a son named Louis, who would go on to be Louis XIII. He didn't want his wife to become queen. In fact, he forestalled her being crowned for 10 years. He probably rightfully feared that that might threaten a Medici takeover of the government of Paris. But after the young Louis turned 10 and appeared to be healthy and a probable heir, and there were a couple of backups who we'll get to later, after that, Henry relented and allowed Maria de' Medici to be crowned queen. Literally the very next day, he was assassinated, reportedly by a Catholic zealot who happened to be in town, but there were, of course, whispers of assassination. Now, we don't have any proof of that, but the Medici were well known in Italy for their occasionally less than scrupulous tactics. Those tactics had gotten 2 popes raised from their family during Henry's lifetime. The Medici and the Valois were almost synonymous, and the people of France deeply resented that fact. Not just the Medici influence, but all of this foreign influence in general. Of course, that's just the way politics were played, but it's noteworthy here, because that foreign queen, Maria de' Medici, who was now the queen regent, organized a marriage between Louis XIII, her son, and a Habsburg princess named Anne of Austria. That's Louis's mother, and she's important. Keep her in mind. In fact, the women in this story are all important. Catherine and Maria were arguably 2 of the most powerful people in the history of France, and Anne, well, we'll get to Anne. Among the most controversial and impactful of Anne's actions involved her personal confessor, someone that she invited into the court as her own counselor, but who became much more than that. Cardinal Armand Plessis, the Duke of Richelieu. Now, of course, Richelieu deserves an entire episode. They could do an entire podcast on just his actions in France. But for now, Richelieu and the Queen Mother, Maria de' Medici, they despised one another. And the people, well, Maria was yet another powerful Italian, while Richelieu was a native son of France. The power struggles between those 2 are legendary and full of all of these thrusts and parries and counter-thrusts that, well, they just make your head spin. But that's a whole other story. To break that down, Richelieu was intent on wresting power out of the hands of a foreign monarch and back into French hands. Ostensibly, the king's hands, which is what he did work toward, but in reality, it was his own hands. Now, Maria executed a coup against Richelieu and thought she had succeeded, but that did eventually see her exiled from France by her own son, and that put Richelieu firmly on top. Now keep in mind here, Anne of Austria, a foreign Habsburg monarch, created this monster. But the thing about creating monsters intent on wresting power out of the hands of foreign monarchs is, well, you can see where this is going. After Maria de' Medici was exiled, French politics devolved once again into a power struggle between Richelieu, the French native, and Anne of Austria. And that, of course, put the king, Louis XIII, firmly in the middle of all that. And, unfortunately, Louis XIII was a poor king, especially for his time and place. See, this was the era of the English Civil War and the Dutch War for Independence. Crowned heads were being lost all over the European map, and at this moment, parliamentary power appeared to be very much in fashion. And this is the important bit. The French nobility were calling for an Estates General. Those of you who are familiar with the French Revolution might remember how the monarchy feels about Estates General. But there was this sense of uprising in France. However, before we get into that, we need to introduce one more player to this story, Giulio Mazzarino. better known to history as Cardinal Mazzeran. Now, despite his fame as a cardinal, Mazzeran was never a priest. As a young man living in Rome, he developed something of a reputation for gambling and debts and heavy drinking and a couple of illegitimate children. So his father sent him off to join the military. But he just got the kind of cushy under-officer gig that allowed him to ride a horse and dress very well and drink and gamble and seduce other men's wives. It was perfect for Mazzarino. But when he received word that his mother's health was failing, he abandoned his post. He didn't even notify his commanding officer. And that eventually saw him dragged before the Pope and begging for forgiveness, which he did very eloquently. The Pope found Mazzeran to be a charming, intelligent young man that had an obvious talent for stretching the truth without ever quite breaking it. And so he appointed Mazzeran to be a papal envoy. Now, Mazzeran first was sent to Spain, and there was a war going on between France and Spain because there was always a war going on between France and Spain. But that job brought him into contact with Cardinal Richelieu. Now, at first, Richelieu did not like Mazzeran at all. He saw him as nothing but a Spanish agent and kind of a fop. But eventually, after working with Mazzeran on a few deals, he began to notice that intelligence, the same qualities that the Pope had seen in this man. And in 1631, when he was eventually appointed papal envoy to Paris, Mazzeran met the royal family. Now, I was tempted to use the phrase, Mazzeran charmed the pants off the queen, but, well, of course, women didn't wear pants, and that's a bit on the nose. He did send flowers and perfume and jewelry and paintings and sculptures from wherever he was in Europe, all back to the Queen, Anne of Austria. Now, you might think that the king would notice and be upset at this sort of behavior, but two things to note. First of all, this was a royal marriage. They were usually loveless political affairs, as was the case here, and more to the point, Louis XIII was gay. He certainly preferred the company of men. It's one of those topics that's danced around in a lot of older histories because I suppose they felt uncomfortable talking about the king's boyfriend, but he certainly had one. Several, in fact, but one favorite who will play a role in this story. Suffice it to say, the king didn't really care if Mazzeran was charming the pants off of the queen. But Richelieu noticed, and he cared. He sent word back to Rome that this envoy needed to be reined in. So Mazzeran was recalled and spent 2 years in the Holy City. And two major events took place while he was gone. In 1635, the situation in Europe deteriorated, and it did so drastically and quickly. There was a war between German Protestants and Catholics, and it had grown on the fringes to include Dutch and Danish and Swedish and even a few English forces and some Spaniards. But France had stayed firmly out of the war. But then, a Protestant army was defeated on her northeast border, and the Habsburgs were all of a sudden on her doorstep. Louis XIII might not have been a powerful king, but he wasn't a stupid king. He knew exactly why he had a Habsburg queen. It was to bring peace between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons. But he and Richelieu were of one mind in this. France knew that their sovereignty was threatened, and they declared war on the Habsburgs in Spain and the Holy Roman Empire and the Netherlands. With this action, the 30 Years' War was on. Now, this put pause to all of those parliamentary aspirations of the nobility, at least for the time. There was a war to fight, and when there were Spaniards and Germans to kill, that was what took precedence. They were all for that. But they still nursed all of their plans, and they even used the war occasionally to bolster their own positions for their parliamentary aspirations. But on the 5th of September, 1638, they had another blow dealt to their plans. The Queen of France and of Austria gave birth to a baby boy. Upon his birth, this baby Louis was called Dieudonné, or God-given. Will Durant writes, quote, "Perhaps the French could not believe that Louis XIII had achieved parentage without divine assistance." End quote. And he writes this almost immediately after pointing out just how little Louis resembled his paternal grandfather. On an entirely different subject, completely off topic here, Cardinal Richelieu was confident and handsome. He was a little older, but distinguished and strong and intelligent. There may or may not be anything there. But that didn't stop the talk in France. Gossip spread. Richelieu was a cardinal in the church, and the people of France called baby Louis Dieudonné, God-given. Get it? That famous French wit at work. But as the war picked up steam, Mazzeran was officially raised a cardinal back in Rome. And remember that at this time a cardinalship was more of a political office than an ecclesiastical one. As representatives of the Pope, they couldn't let too much religion get in the way of their work. But as Cardinal Mazzeran, he went back to Paris as papal envoy in the hopes that he might bring Richelieu and the king to their senses and finally bring an end to French involvement in the war. But that's not how things worked out. Mazzeran was firmly in Richelieu's camp. He was installed as Deputy First Minister of State, Richelieu's number 2. Officially, that made him maybe the third or maybe fourth most powerful person in France, but practically speaking, he was number 2. Now, that was a powerful position, and it worked out well for the 2 ministers of state. Richelieu was at this point consumed by the war, and that allowed Mazzeran to focus more on domestic matters. While Richelieu was busy on the front, Mazzeran could rush around France and put out fires. For example, there were a few rebellious plots against the king. And while I say they were against the king, really they were against Richelieu. The aristocracy in France didn't care for the job that he had been doing. Now, I'm about to throw a bunch of French names and titles at you, and most of them you only kind of need to know, so feel free to zone out a bit here. But all of this, everything we're going to cover from here on out, can be traced back to the Queen Mother, Maria de Medici. She was at this point living in London, where her daughter was the Queen, the wife of the Stuart King there. All of her French contacts, which she had a number of, well, they were all located right across the Channel. In northern France, mostly in Normandy, though some, in fact several, as far south as Orleans. For example, there was the Comte de Soissons, King Louis XIII's cousin. He had a plan to assassinate Cardinal Richelieu and to supplant his cousin on the throne. His sister was also involved in that plan, and that was the Duchess de Longueville. She was famously very beautiful and married to a much older man, and she is a major player in this story. When I say to keep your eyes on the women, she's one of those you need to keep your eye on. The Duchess de Longueville, the Comte de Soissons, and even the king's own brother, the Duc d'Orléans, well, they were the most prominent nobles that were involved in all of these plots against the king, and you might notice that they were all named Bourbon. Now, this wasn't the Duc d'Orléans' first rodeo. He had been involved in a number of plots to put himself on the throne, which I think was kind of expected of brothers to the king. Got to keep everybody sharp. But all of them were backed by Maria de Medici and aimed directly at Cardinal Richelieu. Even though he was still Gaston Bourbon, Duc d'Orléans, he was kind of under house arrest at this point. He wasn't really allowed to leave his palace in Orléans. Now, that plot to assassinate Cardinal Richelieu fell apart, as did all of the plots to assassinate Cardinal Richelieu. But that's why Cardinal Jules Mazzeran was living in Orléans. He used it as a base to keep an eye on the brother of the king, but also to put out all of those rebellious fires that were taking place up there in northern France because of the Queen Mother in London. But it was there, in Orléans, where he learned of a plot between Gaston, the Duc d'Orléans, the king's brother, and the King of Spain. The Duke intended to lose, which we should read surrender, to surrender an important fortress in the northwest of France to a Spanish army. Now, this was yet another plan to assassinate Richelieu and replace the king, and they were going to do so with Spanish Habsburg support. But the Duke was no longer the intended king. There was now a son and heir to King Louis XIII, and no one, not even the Duc d'Orléans, was going to upset that kind of balance or have the blood of an infant on their hands. The difference is that instead of Richelieu and Mazzeran, it would be the Duc d'Orléans and the Duchess de Longueville and Soissons and that lot that would hold the real reins of power. The queen behind this plan to assassinate Richelieu and replace the king, that was not Maria de Medici. It was Anne of Austria. She had orchestrated this entire plan. She was plotting to remove her husband and Richelieu and put her own son on the throne with these other Bourbons and herself the real power behind the throne. Now, Mazzeran brought this to Richelieu and the king and exposed the whole plot to the light of day except for one key element. The Comte de Soissons was executed. The Duc d'Orléans was exiled and took his young daughter, Anne-Marie Louis d'Orléans, who we will be talking a ton about next time, with him. But Mazzeran, who knew that the queen was involved here, kept his mouth shut about her involvement. Had he told Richelieu and the king that she was part of the plan, she might have been exiled or even executed. But Mazzeran took steps to ensure that that did not happen. The queen knew that Mazzeran knew, and Mazzeran knew that she knew that he knew, and I would love to be able to hear the hidden conversation they had about exactly what she was up to. This act of treason, which is what it was, this solidified the relationship between Cardinal Mazzeran and Anne of Austria. See, within the year, Cardinal Richelieu would be dead, probably of natural causes, and Mazzeran was installed in his place as First Minister of France. And that made Cardinal Mazzeran and Anne of Austria, in a very real way, the power couple in France. But there was another power couple that we need to mention here. While the two male Bourbons who were involved in that last plot were either executed or exiled, the Duchess de Longueville, she wasn't implicated, at least not officially. Her marriage to the Duc de Longueville was unfulfilling, so she began an affair, a very public and publicized affair, with the Duc de la Rochefoucauld. Now, he was an army officer at this point, but he had been sent to the Bastille more than once for seditious writing. Those two, the Duchess de Longueville and the Duc de la Rochefoucauld, grew in influence. It was becoming clear to anybody who had any political savvy whatsoever that they were kind of a court in exile. Paris was at this point in the hands of Mazzeran, an Italian, and the Queen, an Austrian. And the king, he wasn't blind to this state of affairs. He took steps to protect his kingdom from his wife. See, his health had begun to fail, but he took the proper steps and wrote a will. His son, upon his death, was to take the throne, even though he was very young. But his wife, Anne of Austria, was not to be installed as regent under any circumstances. Instead, Louis XIII's uncle was to lead a regency council. Now that uncle was the father of the Duchess de Longueville and the Comte de Soissons, and they would probably be on that council as well. A lot of treasonous Bourbons would be involved, but they would be French Bourbons, rather than foreign influence. Now this was probably a good plan. However, we'll never know if it was a good plan, because the king died within a year of Richelieu, and no one, not even the leader of that regency council, wanted to see that will enacted. With Richelieu, the real power in France, and King Louis XIII, the head of state, both dead so quickly, there was a power vacuum, and everybody scrambled to fill that power vacuum. Now, had the nobles decided to enforce the king's will and empowered their own ranks, they might have been able to secure their agenda, but they would be doing so on a limited basis. Instead, they decided to take a gamble. Shortly after the king died, Queen Anne decided to pull a Cersei Lannister and told everyone that she was going to rip up the king's words and install herself as regent. Now that is treason, but the nobles all just went along with it. They all agreed. See, if they decided to enforce the king's will, they'd have to enforce the king's will, and that meant backing the new king. Instead, should they allow this German queen and her Italian lackey to tear up the king's will, those two would take the blame. Then the nobles could swoop in and save the day from those foreign traitors and put themselves in real power. The only things standing in their way were Anne of Austria, Cardinal Mazzeran, and Louis XIV. We all know that Louis XIV is not quietly assassinated as a toddler, so there's not a lot of suspense here. But it's the how that interests me. When I talk about the experiences that those young French mariners who would go on to become buccaneers later in life, when I talk about their experiences, those political and social events that might have shaped their early life, this is what I'm talking about. Will Durant and Ariel Durant, it would be a crime to omit her, they wrote, quote, Mazarin had to rely on patience, craft, and charm. He had the disadvantage of foreign birth. He assured France that though his tongue was Italian, his heart was French, but he was never quite believed. His head was Italian, his heart was his own. We do not know how much of it he gave to the queen. He served her and his ambition zealously, and won her affection, perhaps her love. He knew that his safety and hers lay in continuing Richelieu's policy of building up the power of the monarchy against the feudal lords. End quote. Cardinal Mazzeran and Anne of Austria were planning to save the institution of monarchy for their very young king. And for the record, I don't consider them the heroes here. I'm not really sure that that was a good idea even at the time. Generally speaking, I'm for the toppling of monarchies, but, hopefully you can do so in a way that doesn't lead to, the French Terror or the horrors of Bolshevik Russia. But on the other hand, I'm not terribly fond of oligarchy either, and that was the other option. I mean, it's a step in the right direction when compared to absolute monarchy, but none of that matters. The kind of revolutions that I might support were still a couple of 100 years off. What we have here is a revolt of the aristocracy that looks not unlike what was happening in England. This is, of course, the Fronde. So, why did the Fronde begin? I've mentioned the parliamentary ambitions of the nobility, but why did they have those ambitions? Well, let's break down the French aristocracy really, really fast. There were essentially two branches of the aristocracy. The oldest, proudest, landed and titled aristocracy, those ancient families that sent their sons off to serve in the army for generation after generation, that was the noblesse d'épée, the aristocracy of the sword. The second branch was called the noblesse des robes, or the aristocracy of magistrates. They were generally seen as kind of nouveau riche, but of course this was that period in European history where nouveau riche middle-class families were popping up all over the place. They generally had more money and more power than the old aristocracies, but they didn't have the influence or the grandeur that those famous names had. The first to concern us are the noblesse des robes. They certainly weren't the common people of France, not by a long shot. The Third Estate was a very large and very poor group of people. However, the aristocracy of magistrates made up the various parlements around France, which wasn't a national parliament. They were smaller administrative parliaments. However, under Richelieu, the Parlement had been denied rights to approve laws and impose taxes and make political appointments. Those were traditional, feudal responsibilities of local lords that had been taken over by the noblesse des robes. However, under Richelieu, they had been given to governors appointed by the king, which means Richelieu. So the Parlement of Paris, the aristocracy of lawyers, the closest thing to a national parliament they might have, demanded an Estates General. That is, of course, where the nobility, the clergy, and the people get together to hold a general parliament. They were, however, denied in that. However, the very, very young king and his mother met the Parlement of Paris at the Palais Justice on 12th July, 1648. The opening statement of that meeting reads in the kind of revolutionary language I love. Quote, "For 10 years France has been reduced to ruin. The peasantry must sleep upon straw, for their effects have been sold to pay taxes. To enable certain people to live in luxury in Paris, countless innocent persons must survive on the meanest bread, owning nothing but their souls, and that merely because nobody has devised a means to put them up for sale." End quote. Then the Parlement of Paris issued a list of demands to the king and queen mother that, at the time, seemed positively revolutionary. They wanted their affairs to go back to the way things had been before Richelieu, the lowest ebb of royal privilege in France. As you can imagine, the Habsburg princess turned Queen of France heard their demands, understood their complaints, and enacted the reforms without question. Yeah, I'm just messing with you. She arrested all the leadership and threw them into the Bastille. Given what we know of later French history, the response was going to be obvious. The people erected barricades around Paris, they looted the local torch and pitchfork emporium, and marched on the Palais Royal like the townsfolk in a Frankenstein movie. Really, though, they were more fond of another weapon. They had slings that they used for throwing rocks, kind of a David and Goliath thing. And this earned them the nickname Frondeurs, and that gave the rebellion its name, the Fronde. When they marched on the palace, they chanted, "Vive le roi, à mort Mazzeran." Essentially, up with the king, kill Cardinal Mazzeran. However, the cardinal was already gone, along with the young king and his mother. The Frondeurs, though, held the city of Paris, and they continued to hold it for several months under a leadership of a growing clique of noble rebels. Will Durant describes that clique, and I'm going to read a relatively long passage here, but I just love the language. Quote, "Many nobles saw in the revolt a chance to win the restoration of feudal privileges. Perhaps also they feared that the uprising would get out of hand without pedigreed leadership. Great lords like the Duc de Longueville and Bouillon, and even the Prince de Conti of royal Bourbon blood, joined the rebellion and brought to it soldiers, funds, and romance. The Duchess de Bouillon and the Duchess de Longueville came to live in the Hôtel de Ville as voluntary hostages, guaranteeing the fidelity of their husbands to the Parlement and the people. While Paris became an armed camp, titled ladies danced in the city hall, and the Duchess de Longueville carried on a liaison with the Prince de Marsillac, who was not yet the Duc de la Rochefoucauld and not yet cynical. On January 28th, the Duchess raised the morale of the revolt by giving birth to Marsillac's son. Many Frondeurs bound themselves as chivalric servitors to high-born ladies who bought their blood with condescending smiles. End quote. That's the court in exile of the Duchess de Longueville and the Duc de la Rochefoucauld I mentioned, now ensconced in the middle of Paris, with an army of Parisian peasants under them. Now, the Queen Mother tried to return to Paris at one point, without Mazzeran and without her son. They were safely out of the city, but the crowd there shouted her back out of town. They did so primarily with jeers about her relationship to Mazzeran, which I bet sounded polite and fancy in the French. But the Queen, realizing how desperate the situation had become, raised an army under the Great Condé. That's the older brother of the Frondeur Condé. And that army besieged Paris. Then came the fatal mistake. When the Queen chose to side with Mazzeran, what she did was snub her distant relations in Spain. The noble Frondeurs still had those ties to the Spanish Habsburgs and decided to use them. They reached out to Spain for military aid to fight this French army raised by the Queen. Now, think about all of that foreign influence that I've been talking about today. Italians and Austrians and Spaniards all trying to gain a foothold in French politics. The people of France were happy to fight for the French noblemen and noblewomen that led them, people with names like Longueville and Rochefoucauld, but when they had to fight under or alongside Spanish soldiers, well, that was too much to consider. I mean, whatever your politics may be, seeking foreign aid to secure your place in power is never a good look. The support that the Frondeurs had enjoyed melted away almost immediately. The nobles sent a letter to the Queen, telling her that they had only joined the rebellion to guard her and the young king's interests against an unruly Parisian mob. Now, they never minced words about supporting Mazzeran. They said that they did not and they would not, but their position in the rebellion was merely to guide the Frondeurs safely until they disbanded, so there wouldn't be too much loss of life. They never mentioned the proposed Spanish army, although the Queen did know about it. See, this letter was a lie, and everyone knew it. The Queen knew it, and the Frondeurs knew it, and the Frondeurs knew the Queen knew it, and on and on. But when Queen Anne and Cardinal Mazzeran and the very young Louis XIV re-entered Paris, they found that the barricades had been torn down and cleaned up, and the court awaited them at the Palais Royal eagerly. All was forgiven, nothing was forgotten. Life appeared to go back to normal for the French people, for the French aristocracy, for the royal court, for the Parlement, but it didn't last. The first parliamentary fronde was closer to what we might see as a people's revolution. The people of Paris and much of central and northern France were in open revolt against the king and his mother, and mostly the Catholic Cardinal Mazzeran. Now, Cardinal Mazzeran was the lightning rod for all of the Frondeurs' ire, but the Fronde wasn't an anti-Catholic movement. There were a few Huguenots in the Fronde's leadership, and we'll talk about them in a bit, but most Frondeurs were Catholic, as were most French people. One of the key leaders in the First Fronde was the Archbishop of Paris, another cardinal, known as Cardinal de Retz. The primary difference between the two cardinals, between Mazzeran and de Retz, was their nationality. De Retz did come from an Italian family, but he was born Jean-François on French soil. He was a Frenchman, while Giulio Mazzarino would never be. Now, de Retz was a bad cardinal, but a good Frondeur. He was a remarkably honest and candid chronicler of the entire revolt. He wrote about it in depth in his memoirs and talked about the sins and failings of all of the Frondeur leadership, including his own. Quote, "I did not act the devotee because I could not be sure how long I should be able to play the counterfeit. Finding I could not live without some amorous intrigue, I managed an amour with Mademoiselle de Pomereux, a young coquette who had so many sparks at her devotions that the apparent business of others was a cover for mine. I came to a resolve to go on in my sins, but I was fully determined to exert my utmost to save other souls, though I took no care for my own." End quote. That's the kind of sinful honesty I can get behind. I like this guy. But many of his fellow Frondeurs didn't, especially the Huguenot and humanist elements within their ranks. Oddly, though, even though Cardinal de Retz stood in opposition to Mazarin, the very young King Louis and the Queen Mother, Anne of Austria, seem to have held him in high regard. Maybe it was just to mollify the people of Paris, but when the First Fronde ended, the royal family let de Retz keep his job and even appointed him envoy to Rome. But that comes after today's events. When the First Fronde ended, officially, Mazarin signed the Peace of Rueil that declared King Louis the rightful monarch of France. Everyone thought that that would signal an end to the Civil War and a return to courtly infighting, but they were only half right. This is episode 146, Playing Mars. The courtly posturing did resume in earnest almost immediately, but the fighting wasn't over. There were 3 families at the center of all of it, all of whom we met last time. There were the 3 siblings from the Condé branch of the House of Bourbon. We all remember the sister, the Duchess de Longueville, one of the leaders in the Parliamentary Fronde, but then there was the younger brother, Le Petit Condé. He was another Fronde leader. However, the elder brother we only talked about briefly. Le Grand Condé was the outlier in their family. Le Grand Condé led the army that liberated Paris from his siblings. A cynical person might suspect that he sat on the sidelines during the Fronde to hedge his family's bets. Should the Fronde prevail, 2 Condé siblings were involved in it. But should it fail, the much more likely possibility, the Grand Condé liberated Paris and could claim a position of influence in the royal court. Le Grand Condé believed that his support in the Fronde deserved a position in the court, but not just any position. He thought he deserved the job of First Minister of State, a position which belonged to Cardinal Mazzeran. The power struggle between the Grand Condé and Mazarin was a great courtly drama. It really defined most of 1649, but that's nothing compared to what was going to happen next. And that comes into play with the second family. Now, I can't pronounce their last name, so I'm not going to assault your ears with it, but they played their cards very much like the Condé did. The younger brother in that second family, the Duc de Bouillon, was in the Palais Justice alongside the other Frondeurs. We talked about him last time. But the elder brother, Henri, the Viscount de Turenne, was... Well, I'll tell you what it reminds me of. In American politics, people tend to be pretty divided, but military officers tend to be kind of above that, or maybe outside of it. Not all of them, and not all the time, but the one that jumps to my mind is someone like a Colin Powell. They don't seem to get wrapped up in the partisan nature of politics. That's the role that the Viscount of Turin played in France. The Viscount rose in prominence as a skilled and talented commander during the Dutch War against Spain, then in the 30 Years' War, and eventually served as the Marshal General of France. That was the highest rank in the French army, but it was kind of a new rank. It had been created by Cardinal Richelieu when he abolished the office of Grand Constable. The Grand Constables had been the commanders-in-chief of the army, and in fact that actually plays a role in our story today. Richelieu abolished the Grand Constables and made the Marshals General a thing because he believed that the commander-in-chief should be the king, not some separate officer. That established royal hegemony over the army, which upset a number of army officers. After the First Fronde ended, the Viscount de Turenne stayed out of the political infighting. He even left France for a while, which upset the First Minister. Cardinal Mazzeran wasn't happy with that, and how he deals with it is going to show us how his leadership style stacks up against that of Richelieu, and it's not great. All three of the Condé siblings were plotting against Cardinal Mazzeran, as was the Duc de Bouillon, but Turenne wasn't. Turenne was just sitting on the sidelines, without much of an army to his name. Regardless, though, Cardinal Mazzeran decided to remove Turenne from his post as Marshal General and to include him in the flurry of arrest warrants that he issued against all of the other Frondeurs. In the wake of her brother's arrests, the Duchess de Longueville fled central France for Turenne, who was now on the chopping block. Turenne prepared for war as best he could without the support of the royal crown, and Will and Ariel Durant describe the fallout of this decision on the part of Cardinal Mazzeran thus, quote, Mazzeran, playing Mars, led an army toward Flanders and defeated the invincible Turenne. Meanwhile, de Retz persuaded the Parliament to renew its demand for the exile of Mazzeran. Losing his nerve, the cardinal ordered the release of the imprisoned prisoners, and then, fearing for his life, fled to Veal. End quote. This was, on the part of the cardinal, a declaration of war against the former Frondeurs. But he almost immediately lost his nerve, so in this war that Mazzeran had started, the rebels were winning. They had the disbarred Marshal General on their side, and now all of the resources of all of their ancestral lands. They had everything they needed to win. While the First Civil War is considered a parliamentary struggle, this second outbreak of conflict is considered a noble or aristocratic Fronde. However, those aristocrats made some bad decisions. The rebel lords declared war against the royal crown, which made some of the neutral lords uncomfortable. Then they signed alliances with both Spain and with England, under the person of Cromwell. This made many of those same neutral nobles even more nervous, and then the rebel lords declared their intent to establish a republic in France. Now, I love this move. I think it's a good one. But it was a bridge too far for some of the aristocracy, and it was in this moment that the Queen saw her opening. Well, technically King Louis XIV, but he was only 13, so really it was the Queen. She banished Cardinal Mazzeran from France, and it was at this point that she reinstated de Retz and made him envoy to Rome, which appeased the people of Paris, and then the Queen offered Turenne his place as Marshal General. Turenne gladly agreed to this return to power and to his post. The first target at which the Queen pointed the Marshal General was a breeding ground for rebellion, the city of Orleans. And that brings us to our next major player in this story, who Will Durant describes as one of the most famous of France's many famous women. You might remember the Duc d'Orléans, the former king's brother, the current king's uncle, who was chased out of France for treason along with his daughter. That daughter, Marie de Bourbon, the king's first cousin, was strong and tall. She was also proud. She was known to have said, quote, "I am of a birth that does nothing that is not great and noble." End quote. These traits earned her the nickname La Grande Mademoiselle, but they did not help her when she sought to sell her support for the king with a marriage proposal. She wanted to marry King Louis XIV, her first cousin, in order to be brought back into the fold of loyalty. Louis, though, was never going to marry La Grande Mademoiselle. I mean, put aside the whole first cousin thing for a second. The King of France was intended to marry maybe the Infanta of Spain, or maybe some Italian or German princess, or someone relevant to international politics. That's what kings do. He was never going to marry a rebellious cousin. At this moment, I want to take a quick pause. We'll get back to the story at hand in a moment, but I want to discuss why we're telling this story in the first place. I'd like you to imagine that you're a sailor in 17th century France, maybe northern France, in one of the channel ports, perhaps. You could be in the Navy or on a merchant ship, or even just a coastal fisherman, but whatever you choose, that's you, right now. Right across the channel, a stone's throw away, the English just overthrew the monarchy. They established a theocratic military dictatorship, that's true, but they overthrew the monarchy all the same. Just next door, the Dutch had a whole war to establish their own republic. Now, you're a sailor. You've been to those Dutch and English ports a ton. You know all about this stuff. But let's add to that. You're a sailor in 17th century France and a Protestant, much like the Dutch and the English and several of those nobles who are currently in open rebellion against the king, the very, very Catholic king who appears to be under the influence of an evil Roman cardinal. If you were that sailor, where would you put your loyalty? Perhaps in the Huguenot lords from your neck of the woods that proposed to establish a republic in place of this theocratic monarchy, maybe? I want you to keep that in mind. I want you to try and hold on to that mindset while we move on, because these sailors were learning about everything we're talking about today as it happened. The king's first cousin, the Grande Mademoiselle Marie de Bourbon, very much like Joan of Arc before her, complete with a full suit of armor on the back of a war horse, marched on the walls of her home city of Orleans. And did I mention, by her side she had an honor guard of other high-born women on their own war horses with their own armor, brandishing their own swords. The Princess of Orleans was denied entry to her home city, and ordered her own soldiers to blow a hole in the wall, and once the wall was down, she marched through with her honor guard of heavily armed, beautiful Amazons carrying the flag. And even if that's not exactly how it happened, isn't that the story that you and your friends, who are also sailors in 17th century France, isn't that the story that you would tell? These are the kind of myths that blossomed during the Second Fronde, when a bunch of the French boucaniers who would soon be active in the Caribbean were still young men in France. Now, Marie de Bourbon did blow a hole in the wall of Orleans and did march through, but I imagine that when those young sailors in the Channel ports pictured that event, she wasn't wearing the serviceable armor she did wear, but instead video game armor, maybe a chainmail bikini, for example. Anne-Marie was a badass with an amazing suit of armor, but if she had chainmail bikinis, she saved them for her Swedish girlfriend. But that comes later. For the time being, she still harbored dreams of being queen, and in the summer of 1652, Anne-Marie de Bourbon marched on Paris with her army. But she wasn't the only army marching on Paris. We should note at this point that there was another pretty major war going on between France and Spain at the time, so there were armies all over the place. We'll talk more about that next time, but all of those armies were hungry and terrorizing the populace, and everyone was eager to end the fighting. So when the Lady of Orleans marched on Paris in an attempt to capture her future husband, to execute Mazzeran, and to imprison her mother-in-law, her prospective mother-in-law, two other armies marched as well. Anne-Marie did capture some of the city, including the Bastille, which she turned into a fortress, but the king's forces held out at the palace. Turenne and the king's army marched from the front with the Spanish Netherlands up to the northeast, while the elder Condé brother marched from the southeast. Those two armies, the army of Turenne, the king's army, and the army of La Grande Condé, met outside of the walls of Paris, near the Bastille, on the 2nd of July, 1652. Turenne, the Marshal General, one of the most decorated officers in French history, was a better general than La Grande Condé. He held the walls, guarding Paris from the rebel army under La Grande Condé, and he was definitely winning, pushing Condé back and routing his army. But then, from behind Turenne's forces, there was a thundering of cannon. The guns of the Bastille opened up and crashed into the back of the king's forces. Anne-Marie de Bourbon had to threaten the artillery officer with her sword, but she fired upon the king's army. And I imagine her standing atop the walls of the Bastille in full plate mail. She and her honor guard of Amazons holding swords aloft while the smoke clears and Turenne's army scatters. Probably not how it really happened, but Anne-Marie de Bourbon was the hero of the day. She was the Lady of Paris and the champion of the Second Fronde. They were victorious. So, you're that young sailor at a tavern on the coast of the Channel, maybe enjoying a drink with some friends and talking about the victory of the Republican army. You're toasting and laughing and drinking some cheap wine, but you're enjoying the thoughts of the brave new world in which you find yourself. The injustices of the past were now over in this new republic. In short, you feel hope. But that wouldn't last, would it? Thanks largely to the selfish incompetence of the aristocracy. La Grande Condé, a prince, remember, ran into the same problems that have doomed revolution after revolution. All of a sudden, as soon as they achieved victory, they had the responsibilities of leadership on their shoulders without the resources to see them through. The Frondeurs had won, but France was still under imminent invasion from Spanish forces, and the Frondeurs didn't have access to the royal treasury. They weren't able to pay the troops. Now, they might have been able to if they had pooled their resources. Anne-Marie de Bourbon was really, really rich, but they didn't pay their troops. So the army began to desert. And when the Cardinal Mazzeran, remained unarrested and free and alive, the people of Paris, who were singularly concerned with Mazzeran, began to riot. Now, the young King Louis and his mother fled Paris once again. Mazzeran fled as well, but he went into yet another exile. For 4 months, the Frondeurs tried to get Paris under control, but it was really the mob that ruled the city. And the propertied bourgeois middle class began to panic at this state of affairs, what with the rioting and the property destruction. Will Durant describes this period of fizzling out, quote, Cardinal de Retz used his influence to encourage loyalty to the king. On October 21, the royal family re-entered Paris peacefully. The sight of the young monarch, 14, handsome and brave, charmed the Parisians. The streets resounded with Vive le Roi. Almost overnight, public agitation subsided and order was restored, not by force, but by the aura of royalty, the prestige of legitimacy, and the half-unconscious belief of the people in the divine right of kings. By February 6, 1653, Louis felt strong enough to recall Mazzeran again, and to re-establish him in all his former powers. The Second Fronde was over. End quote. Now, I read that in part because there are a few ideas in there that I wanted to get across, but that I disagree with. There's the whole unconscious belief in the divine right of kings stuff, which I completely disregard. I think the people of Paris craved stability no matter where it came from. But Durant also says that the Second Fronde was over. And it was effectively over, but that doesn't mean that Will Durant was right about the divine right of kings stuff. But the rebellion, the Fronde, was absorbed into the larger, ongoing Franco-Spanish War. Though, really, the Frondeurs' part in that was pretty inconsequential, especially once the royals signed an alliance with the Stuarts over in England. We'll get back to the situation in France in a second, but once again, let's pause. You're still that sailor, sitting in maybe a different tavern this time, sharing some drinks once again, but there's a different feeling in the room. All the hope you had had just a few weeks earlier, gone. The evil Cardinal Mazzeran was back in power, and the idea of a republic was dead. Now, the drinks probably weren't rum. The sugar trade was still in its infancy. There probably weren't any parrots around, but there were a bunch of guys in eye patches holding their swords and grumbling about the government. And you know how, in the U.S. at least, every time we have a presidential election, when things start to get really contentious near the end, when people begin to get really hyperbolic about the whole thing, some obnoxious pundit or several will begin to threaten to leave the country should whichever person they hate win the election. We've all heard that, but of course those people never do. But what if those pundits already had a ship ready, and had a few dozen like-minded people to go with them, and instead of a Democrat or a Republican who will change some policies in ways that they disagree with, they're facing an absolute monarch who's going to literally murder them for their religious beliefs? And what if, instead of Canada as their refuge, they have a tropical paradise on the other side of the world with no government whatsoever to tell them what to do? And no offense, Canada, you're all great, but, it's chilly up there. What I'm trying to do here is to frame the mindset of those early French buccaneers in relation to what was happening right here in France. Over the next decade or so, due largely to the policies of King Louis XIV and his counselors, there was going to be a huge wave of French men and women that flowed across the Atlantic, bound mainly for Tortuga. And that brings us, at very long last, to the king. Up to this point, Louis XIV has been kind of a minor character in the drama. He was a boy, occasionally on the run from his home. Now, he had a powerful first minister of state and a powerful queen mother, but they were really in power this entire time. Now, though, Louis found he had an entire kingdom rallying around him and glorying in their monarch. But now that we're here at the point of it all, I wonder where to begin. A biography of Louis XIV, well, I've attacked that from a lot of angles, but I don't like any of them. I mean, do we need to know about Louis's love of dancing and horse riding, or about his many love affairs? Although, I will share one thing. One writer in France at the time who did not like the king said, quote, "Had he been just a private individual, he would have created the same havoc with his love affairs." End quote. Louis was a charmer. But I just can't bring myself to care about that personal stuff. It's not really relevant to our story. Now, of course, there was his wife, and we'll talk about her next time. But instead of all of that personal stuff, we're going to talk about the king's character and his policies, which really brings us back to his counselors. Cardinal Mazzeran continued running the show after the end of the Fronde for 9 more years, although he did so with the king's full support. Mazzeran was a skillful diplomat, but he was deeply corrupt all of his life. He sold political appointments and access to the king and amassed a huge fortune. But in the interim, while amassing that fortune, he trained the king to vet his appointments, to keep a close eye on those people he put in power. This may be the greatest lesson he taught to the king. On his deathbed, Cardinal Mazzeran gave the king one last piece of advice. He told him to be his own chief counselor. And when Mazzeran finally did die, the king confessed, quote, "I do not know what I should have done if he had lived much longer." End quote. The king was ready to become his own man. And when the king's ministers came before him and asked to whom they should address their questions of policy now that Mazzeran was dead, the king replied, quote, "To me." Louis took that last piece of advice of his former first counselor to heart, as well as his other pieces of advice. Louis was known to pop in on his advisors unexpectedly and conduct an impromptu investigation, and if he found their conduct wanting, he was known to fire or even arrest them on the spot. At one dinner, held by a finance minister, at which all of the guests ate on plates of silver or gold, Louis decided to arrest the man who he found to be, quote, "stealing beyond his station," end quote. But the Queen Mother convinced Louis to wait until morning in order to not ruin an enchanting evening. However, on the other hand, when King Louis found someone worth keeping around, he promoted them, based almost entirely on merit. And I really hate to praise an absolute monarch who persecuted religious minorities here, but King Louis did an excellent job sifting through the non-noble classes for the very best candidates that France had to offer. Rather than hiring somebody based on a name, he found somebody who could do the job. And as they say, the cream rises. King Louis found his next first minister of state in the character of a man named Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Colbert and King Louis were the future of the French Empire. The first major action of Jean-Baptiste Colbert was to locate Mazzeran's vast fortune and to make King Louis the richest monarch in Europe. That, of course, allowed Louis to become the greatest patron of arts in the world, but also to conduct a ton of wars. And Colbert was perfect for that job. Before being raised First Minister of State, Colbert had been the Secretary of the Navy, and the future of the French Empire was in their navy. There is a concept in the study of world history called the general crisis. In the broadest terms, it's a theory, or really rather a series of theories, trying to answer why there were so many conflicts and revolutions and just a bunch of chaos from roughly the time Christopher Columbus set sail until about the American Civil War. The overriding theory seems to surround what they call the Little Ice Age, a period of climate change that led to crop failures and famine and general unrest all around the world. Then again, it could also be the technological explosion that gave the world guns and ships and disrupted economic systems the world over. Or maybe it's the printing press and a rise in literacy rates, all of which, of course, led to the Reformation and all of the social unrest that followed that. Personally, and I'm not alone in this, I think that it's got a little bit of all of that, all combined to build this perfect storm of unrest and war and revolution. Now, the general crisis was a global phenomenon, but it's centered in Europe, which, kind of makes sense. It was the era of imperialism and global empires, so those European problems sort of spread over into all of their colonial holdings. But today we're not going to look at the global general crisis. We're going to narrow that field down. The French general crisis began with the Reformation and the wars of religion, and it includes everything we've talked about so far, including the Fronde. But the Fronde was an internal conflict, a civil war, and today we're looking at international affairs, affairs that are going to bring us right up to the eve of the 9 Years' War. This is episode 147, The Sun Was High. Let's talk for a minute about the great man theory. Capital G, capital M, great man theory. It's an old-fashioned theory, outdated even, so, it kind of fits pretty well with the general crisis. But there are two things we need to remember about the great man theory. First, we should acknowledge that the entire idea is inherently flawed due to the exclusion of women. Cleopatra, Queen Isabella, or Catherine the Great, obviously they should all be on that list. Not to mention the French women that we've talked about in this story. Anne of Austria, the Queen Mother, and Anne-Marie d'Orléans, most of all. And second, we should remember the old maxim that the great men are almost always bad men. And that should include the women who should be on the list, even Queen Elizabeth, who happens to be my personal favorite. But that is to say that it's an old-fashioned use of the word great. It means, majestic or larger than life, but not necessarily good. The great men were militarists and imperialists. They were defenders and perpetrators of slavery and subjection all around the world. And some of them, if that's not enough, were just undeniably, unquestionably evil. Now, three names tend to jump to mind when the concept of the great men, capital G, capital M, is broached. Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon Bonaparte. They're kind of the Trinity, aren't they? And of course, each successive name would have been very, very proud to be included in that Trinity. But it's hardly a complete list. Who could deny Genghis Khan's place on it, or Charlemagne's? They fit all of the criteria perfectly. Unfettered imperialistic growth? Check. The expansion of their personal power? Check. And the personal leadership of the armies that gave them those first two criteria? Check and check. But that third criteria, the personal leadership of their armies, really narrows down the great man field. It turns it into almost a greatest man list, in that old sense of the word, but being a commander of an army was something that won a lot of hearts and minds. And I personally don't think that military commanders should ever be able to translate that power into political authority. Not to say that military commanders should never hold political office. I like Ike and Teddy Roosevelt, both of whom were military commanders, but I'm a will of the people guy, not a military coup kind of guy. But that third criteria excludes a lot of the people who should and often are included on the great man list. None of the women who we mentioned were commanders in the field, except, I suppose, for Anne-Marie de Bourbon, who, as I've said, was amazing. But that would also exclude other names. For example, and this is who I had in mind when I made the undeniably evil remark, someone like an Adolf Hitler. He was the commander-in-chief of a military dictatorship, yes, but he wasn't a field marshal. And that goes for a ton of less evil characters, a bunch of presidents and prime ministers and even kings. But of course, that brings the leader that we're talking about today into question. Does Louis XIV belong on the great man list? And he did occasionally lead troops in battle, and he was the commander-in-chief, but he wasn't a general, he wasn't a marshal. However, his kingdom was nearly always at war when he was king, and those wars usually stemmed directly from King Louis's plans. Beyond that, they also almost always concerned the very same tiny sliver of land that has obsessed armies all the way back to ancient Rome. Those are, of course, the regions of northeast France known as Alsace and Franche-Comté and Lorraine, as well as Flanders and modern-day Belgium. In the time of our story, though, it was known as the Spanish Netherlands. Now, we know the story of the Spanish Netherlands up until King Louis came to the throne. Spain occupied the entire Netherlands until the Dutch revolt under William the Silent. That's the story of the Sea Rovers. That's, of course, when Elizabeth intervened and the Spanish Armada attempted to invade England, and Francis Drake, along with a bunch of others, fought them off. But it's the French side of that story that we need to focus on today. Henry IV of France signed the Triple Alliance with Elizabeth and William of England and the Netherlands. That was what set the stage for the 30 Years' War. Now, we're not going to revisit that conflict, but suffice it to say that most of the fighting that involved France during the 30 Years' War was concentrated in that area of northeast France. Alsace and Lorraine, Franche-Comté, and the regions of the Holy Roman Empire called the Rhineland. And that fighting continued even after the 30 Years' War and the 80 Years' War were both concluded in 1648. That's the Franco-Spanish War, which lasted until just about the time that Cardinal Mazzeran died and King Louis XIV took up the reins of power. And the treaty that ended the Franco-Spanish War gave King Louis a lot of what he wanted in that region of northeast France. He won a lot of territory from the Spanish Habsburgs. However, France still did not possess what Louis considered her natural border. He wanted to control the land all the way to the Rhine. However, the war was over. It was a time for peace. King Louis was young and rich and powerful and handsome and charming. He took this opportunity to consolidate his gains and to enjoy the benefits of rule. He hosted parties for all of the great names of France. He hosted and attended dances and balls. Culturally, he did a lot for France. He really pushed opera to the fore in French society. Before then, it had been mostly an Italian occupation. He patronized writers and poets and playwrights all across France. He also, beyond the cultural stuff, engaged in some backroom deals to secure the Stuart restoration to the English throne. We know that story as well. But most important, King Louis XIV took the time to find a suitable wife. He had a number of prospective wives, one of whom we'll talk about in some detail later, but the woman who won the hand of King Louis XIV was Maria Theresa, the Infanta of Spain. Maria Theresa and King Louis would not be married until after the conclusion of the Franco-Spanish War, but she was a powerful tool in the negotiations that led to the end of that war. However, not as we might expect, not for Spain. She was a powerful tool for France. Whenever the Spanish king, Maria Theresa's father, appeared to be wavering on this point or that point during the negotiations, all that Louis had to do was set up a meeting in some other kingdom that had a marriageable daughter. Even better if the kingdom had an anti-Habsburg bias. He didn't even have to attend that meeting, just set it up, and Spain would all of a sudden return to the table with her tail between her legs. The only point on which Spain stood absolutely resolute was the question of inheritance rights. Maria Theresa, upon her marriage to King Louis XIV, renounced all of her claims of inheritance to land and titles and money in any Spanish holding. Not only Maria Theresa, but all of her descendants had to adhere to that. To put it bluntly, the Spanish did not want to accept a marriage in which the Bourbon dynasty would ever have any claim on the throne or lands of Spain. That's a lot to ask in a marriage alliance. But in return, the Spanish agreed to pay France a dowry equal to 500,000 gold crowns. The French écu, or French crown, was a relatively new coin, named for the image of the king on one side and the crown on the other. The French crown replaced the traditional gold franc, and due to minting standards that had been enacted by Cardinal Richelieu, the écu was worth somewhere between 4 to 10 francs. The French écu replaced the Spanish doubloon as the most common gold coin in Europe, and it replaced a German coin as the most valuable gold coin, by weight at least. Suffice it to say, the écu was a spectacular piece of coinage, and 500,000 of them was a huge amount of money to pay for a dowry. But it wasn't unreasonable for the forfeit of inheritance rights, a large part of the reason you would marry a foreign princess in the first place. And besides, even though it was a huge amount of money, the Spanish Empire was giant, and the Americas were full of rich gold mines that belonged to Spain, so no problem, right? Even beyond that, because Louis was such a nice guy, he said that he would accept payment in Spanish pieces of 8, that is, silver, or in gemstones, should the raw gold be hard to come by. But Spain's vast riches were not quite as vast as she let on. Spain's coffers were larger than any other in Europe, it's true, but due to the centuries of warfare and their foolishly mismanaged and unregulated expansion policy, the Spanish coffers emptied almost as soon as they were filled. The crown of Spain would never have admitted it to anyone, outside of the Pope maybe, but they were broke. It wasn't poverty. The Spanish crown was still the kind of broke that got to eat off of gold plates and sleep on silk, the kind of broke that the Vatican would still happily loan huge amounts of money, but the crown was broke when compared to nearly every other throne in Europe. Now, I don't like spreading baseless conspiracy theories, despite my history of having done so. So I'm going to preface this by saying that this is probably not what actually happened, largely because the French crown was incapable of orchestrating something this intricate. But isn't it funny that right at the very moment that the Spanish Empire needed to come up with what we would consider billions of dollars, right at that moment is when the crown decided to begin persecuting Huguenots and sexual deviants and debtors and prostitutes and all of their undesirables to such a level that they were forced to flee French shores. Now, I'm not saying that once those undesirables did flee France, that the crown maybe clandestinely urged their colonial governors to encourage the riffraff to sail off for Tortuga, where they could engage in unfettered piracy against the Spanish, who, remember, were currently scrabbling to come up with all the gold and silver they could muster. I mean, that's not the sort of thing that anybody in good standing would suggest. That would be crazy. But even if that wasn't the plan, it did still happen, and it did serve French interests. It allowed them to set down colonial roots on what was definitively Spanish soil, without dirtying anyone in power's hands. Those riffraff, those undesirables, were, after all, only pirates. And, to the point, it made the collection of that massive dowry all the more difficult. When you have to transport your entire treasury across seas that are currently infested by pirates, that makes getting that money dangerous. And the French buccaneers on Tortuga were consummate pirates, but the English did their part as well. Of course, that's the entire history of the Brethren of the Coast and Henry Morgan. But back in England and France, there's Henrietta Stuart, Henrietta of England. Now, Henrietta of England was King Louis's first cousin. Many of you will remember her. She was the sister of Charles II and James II. She lived in the court there at Paris when the Stuarts were in exile during the reign of Cromwell. She was a Catholic, an open Catholic, and in her youth she very nearly married King Louis. She was one of those prospective wives. However, Anne of Austria nixed that. Instead, Henrietta of England married Louis's brother, the new Duc d'Orléans. Will and Ariel Durant describe the Duc d'Orléans, quote, "a little round-bellied man on high-heeled shoes who loved feminine adornments and masculine forms. As brave as any knight in battle, but as painted, perfumed, beribboned, and begemmed as the vainest woman in the vainest land." End quote. In case you can't read between those thoroughly 1950s lines, the Duc d'Orléans was gay. That served Louis's interest, though. That's a good way to keep Henrietta of England close and in the family without the trouble of a husband who might actually fall in love with her. Now, King Louis appears to have genuinely fallen for Henrietta of England, and Henrietta appears to have loved him back, but not romantically. She considered him, like Charles and James, her brother. But still they spent their days dancing and dallying in the gardens and taking long boat rides. Even if there was no romantic aspect to their relationship, everyone in France believed there was. Henrietta of England was behind the secret Treaty of Dover that brought King Charles and King Louis closer together and promised King Charles would declare his Catholicism to all of Europe. Of course, that never came to pass. But that secret Treaty of Dover brings us back to the topic of war. After a few years of what appears to have been a loveless political marriage, through which Louis drowned his sorrows with Henrietta's babysitter, the dowry for the marriage was still not paid. Spanish finances were in shambles, and they would not have been able to pay regardless, but the explosion in piracy in the mid-1660s was a factor, both in Spain's inability to pay the dowry and in the heightened international tensions. This leads us to the War of Devolution. It's an interesting war in terms of early modern military history, and it shows us the Marshal General of France, we met him last time, Turenne, at his very best. But even still, the war itself isn't particularly relevant. However, Louis's reasons for entering the war, as well as the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, were important. The war wasn't about the money. France was doing just fine, thank you very much. Really, it was about territory. And not just the acquisition of more territory, but land that was strategically important to France. As long as other rival and even enemy nations held the western bank of the Rhine, France was vulnerable to invasion, and they were losing out on valuable trade and tax revenue that they would make from the river. So once again, France went to war, while England and the Netherlands and Sweden all signed a new triple alliance against the French. They weren't technically allied with the Spanish, as none of them very much liked Spain, but they fought on the same side. Now, of course, over in the West Indies, governors were issuing letters of marque, and for a minute it looked like the tide might actually turn against France, at least the French in the Caribbean, but the pirates just turned to their old ways and went back to attacking the Spanish. Now, that's not how it worked back on the continent. That Triple Alliance was a sign of something, maybe of a growing attitude, or at least a trend in European diplomacy. France's king, over and over again, would do something that would grow his kingdom and his personal power, and he would even do so at the expense of the Habsburgs, who nobody liked that wasn't a Habsburg. But over and over again, Louis found himself doing that alone. His allies melted away every time he engaged in what was widely seen as an unjust war. Now, the War of Devolution was a land war, for the most part, so there's not a whole lot to talk about that we haven't already discussed that's relevant to the pirates, except for one thing, a tactic that King Louis was very fond of and that worked out well for him every time he used it. The first army that Louis engaged in the War of Devolution, the army under the Marshal General Turenne, had a flurry of victories in the Spanish Netherlands. He captured city after city, and he manned them all with soldiers from his army. Now, that might look like a win, and it was, but it also wasn't. At this point, the fortress cities in the region were important. They were necessary to hold territory, but the only way to win a war was with a mobile army, an army that could fight battles rather than sieges, which is something that Turenne was fond of. It was kind of a maxim of his. Battles, not sieges. But at this point, Turenne's army was spread out in a ton of different fortress cities through which siege was the only way to win. Any concentrated push by the Triple Alliance had the ability to topple all of Turenne's and France's gains, and they could have done so in a few weeks. But this was the plan. Louis wanted to spread his first army, his royal army under Turenne. He wanted to spread them out thin and take those cities. That was the goal. And he knew he wouldn't win the war, but Louis had a second army. And he sent them to war, but not to aid Turenne. Instead, he sent them to an entirely separate piece of land south of where Turenne's forces were. That second army, led by Le Grand Condé, we remember him, marched on the territory of Franche-Comté. That was at the time the southernmost region of the Spanish Netherlands, although part of it belonged to the Holy Roman Empire. Now, Le Grand Condé performed a similar feat to that of Turenne. He defeated the armies in the region and then captured a bunch of different forts and spread his forces out very thin. But at this point, now that he held two large pieces of territory, Louis declared his willingness to come to the table. He was willing to negotiate what would become the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. Now, in those negotiations, Louis was compelled, or maybe agreed, to give Franche-Comté back to the Spanish. But in return for giving that large and valuable piece of land back to Spain, he got to keep most of his gains up in the north, those gains that Turenne had already captured. And those, well, they'd been his real goal the entire time. I mean, he could have sent that second army up to aid Turenne. Le Grand Condé and Turenne hated each other, but they would have fought together on the king's orders. But that would lead to a drawn-out engagement, a long war in which a lot of soldiers and civilians would be killed. He would essentially be feeding his manpower into the meat grinder. Instead, he captured that second piece of territory and then gave it up. And that allowed everyone in this negotiation to save face, and still, even though Louis kind of lost the war, he still got exactly what he wanted. and he did so without a significant loss of life. And it's right here that suggests to me that King Louis XIV does belong in the ranks of the great men. He had this ability to fuse military might, which France had in spades, with diplomacy and common sense, which Louis had in spades. And he also knew how to use those to play on the pride of the other rulers and nobles all across Europe. It was stunning. And he would do this stuff over and over again. Even when France looks like they lost a war, which they kind of just did, Louis gets what he wants. It's brilliant. But of course, the rest of Europe wasn't stupid. They weren't blind. They knew what Louis was up to. But every time that Louis backed them into that corner, they had to accept it. This worked out for Louis, but the gulf between France and the rest of the world, diplomatically at least, widened. But that brings us to 1668. Now, were we talking about Louis's personal life here, or French society in general, this would be the time in which the great artists and famous writers that many of us know began to blossom. When French drama, poetry unseated the great Shakespeare, they became the defining literary movements in Europe. It's when the salons really began to show the power of women in politics and of manners. When Frankish Gallic Catholicism for a time outshone the Habsburgs in Germany and Spain, and even for a moment overawed the Vatican. When the French Empire began to expand to include places like Saint-Domingue. There were colonies in the East Indies and the West Indies. He had a lot of colonies in Madagascar, or at least some of the most significant islands around Madagascar, and of course, Louisiana. And not just the state of Louisiana, everything that was eventually sold to the United States in the Louisiana Purchase. And if you really want to annoy people from Michigan or Missouri or Louisiana, feel free to point out that some of their most famous cities are actually called Detroit and Saint Louis, and of course, Nouveau Orleans. But all of that imperial stuff is really a story that can be shelved until we're back with the pirates. For now, though, we're still talking about French foreign policy and war. The next war, the war that followed the Devolution, that would be the largest war since the 30 Years' War, and it was the last in which Turenne would serve as Marshal General. The Franco-Dutch War, which has been a defining conflict in our entire story, was Turenne's crowning achievement. His very last campaign, his campaign into the Rhineland, through Franche-Comté and deep into the territory of the Holy Roman Empire, that campaign was nothing short of amazing. In that campaign, Turenne faced who would be seen as his foil, his greatest rival, really, and in this war, his really only rival. That was the figure of Montecuccoli. Now, when those two commanders faced off against one another, it was never one-sided. It was this beautiful game of chess. There were two expert commanders vying and maneuvering for position, and they were at it for hours, moving soldiers all day long. Sometimes, when they were at their best, they would, on both sides, have almost no casualties because neither could get a leg up on the other. However, whenever one of those commanders forced the other into an engagement, it always turned into one of the great pivotal battles of the war. But Turenne, in those great pivotal battles, won a lot more than he lost. And he adapted all throughout all his campaigns, but all throughout this campaign, to the terrain and to his enemy's tactics. He learned from his mistakes and got better because of it. This campaign into the Holy Roman Empire saw France at the greatest continental territorial extent she had ever known, and the greatest she would ever know until Napoleon. After Alexander and Caesar, Turenne was probably the single greatest influence on Napoleon Bonaparte. He was certainly his greatest tactical, military influence. And Turenne was a field marshal worth admiring. He believed in mobility and maneuverability, rather than entrenchment or fortification, that old maxim. I remember learning in elementary school that during the American War for Independence, tactics were simple. Two armies would stand across a field from one another and open fire. Now that was how some battles were fought, especially when they were commanded by bad leaders. But someone like Turenne was always on the move, always looking for advantage, and usually he managed to find it. And that might seem obvious to us, but at the time it was novel. He utilized the kind of tactics that we see in smaller engagements. The one that comes to my mind is Henry Morgan at the gates of Panama. In fact, we see tons of pirates using tactics like this, but Turenne used them on a grand military scale. One of those highly mobile chess matches was won by Turenne. He forced his adversary into an encounter. Now, winning that chess match meant that he forced him to fight, not that he won the battle. The Battle of Salzburg was shaping up to be one of the largest and most consequential battles of the entire war, and Turenne definitely had the advantage here. But in the opening salvo, perhaps in the very first volley, the Marshal General of France was struck by a cannonball and killed. Now this battle, that might have forced the Habsburgs into a full retreat, instead turned into a French retreat. It wasn't a rout, it was an orderly retreat, but the French army was incapable of unifying under any single commander or any single plan. Later on, the infantry would condemn their commanders who they said were honored for abandoning Turenne's gains and for running. It was one of the greatest defeats of the war on the side of France. Still, though, even after Turenne died, the conflict went on. Those commanders who took over for the Marshal General fortified the Rhine. They held the natural border that King Louis wanted and managed not to lose any of it, although many of those gains into the Rhineland were lost. In the north, the other major front in the war, the French army pushed into Spanish and Dutch territory to what are essentially the modern borders of France. This was a very favorable position for France. However, it should be noted that those privateers empowered by colonial governors all over the world played a major role in the victory of France. They pushed the other colonial powers into a corner and brought them to the bargaining table. The Peace of Nijmegen granted France all of the formerly Habsburg territory of Franche-Comté, that territory that they had failed to win in the last war. They also secured France's gains in the north, her current modern borders. In return, France had to give up some of her Italian or Genoan territorial gains in the south, which were her largest losses. But on paper, that was definitely a French victory. But that wasn't the reality of the Peace of Nijmegen. England, as I'm sure we all remember, abandoned the secret and open treaties of Dover and switched sides during the conflict, against the wishes of the king, but at the insistence of the Parliament. The English allied with the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs, as well as the Netherlands, some of their oldest and fiercest enemies, against the French. France, diplomatically speaking, after the Franco-Dutch War, was an island. They were diplomatically isolated in the extreme, but I don't want you to take that to mean that France was some kind of rogue state. They weren't North Korea. Everyone may have been angry at France, but that didn't change the fact that France was, once again, victorious. She enjoyed the spoils of war and the splendor of victory. All of those pleasures that King Louis was known to enjoy, the opera and the theater and the arts, all of the colonial goods that were flowing into France, the sugar and the tobacco, and of course the balls and the dances and the women. In all of that, Louis began to indulge. It was at this point, almost immediately following their victory, that Louis began the restoration and the expansion of his father's hunting lodge. Now that might seem small until we realize that that humble hunting lodge would become one of the most famous palaces in all of history, the Palace of Versailles. Go online and see if you can find a picture of the equestrian statue made in commemoration of King Louis after the Peace of Nijmegen. It's a fantastic piece of artistry, that's true, but what it says about the king, he's beautiful. He's got a fantastic mustache, which was the style in France at the time, thanks mostly to Louis himself. He's got these flowing curls that remind you of Alexander the Great or Jim Morrison. But on top of those curls, he's wearing a laurel wreath, a style that harkens back to ancient Roman emperors. In fact, he's wearing Roman imperial military dress. It's not sending a subtle message about his power or his might. King Louis stood astride the world. And everyone, even the most fervent enemies of King Louis XIV, envied his glory, and they all attempted to emulate his splendor. Those who could wore their hair like Louis. They hired famous French painters and sculptors and artisans. And even though those were among some of the most talented, some of the greatest artists in all the world, they were still second to those that Louis personally employed. Now, they used these artists to adorn their own palaces in French art and architecture, and some of those are gorgeous works, but they still pale in comparison to Versailles. The women all across Europe began to wear French dresses, and, if they enjoyed any sort of social standing at all, only French dresses. Courts all around Europe attempted to match the French in their amours and courtly drama and their infidelity. And even in that, everyone paled in comparison. In Paris, it was expected that any woman of rank have at least one extramarital lover, and that was a bare minimum. The women of Paris preferred to have a selection of men who could fulfill whatever their sexual and intellectual and political desires might be on that day. In any given retinue, we might find a sensitive poet, a dashing fencer, a thoughtful philosopher, a brave knight, a powerful political minister, and some of them, even a priest. A priest who could hear their sins while helping them create new ones. One Parisian writer observed these dalliances, quote, "In any town are the husbands as patient as they are here." End quote. But of course we shouldn't feel too bad for the husbands. I mean, who do you think made up all of those lovers? That is, of course, unless the king took their wife to bed. More than once King Louis sent some noble husband with an ancient and powerful name back to their home in a carriage adorned with a cuckold's horns. Meanwhile, Louis would take every liberty with their wives until, invariably, he sent those women back to their homes with a new, illegitimate child, a child who would invariably be raised to the blood and into their stepfather's old rank in preference over their own natural-born children. As you might imagine, this upset a lot of husbands, but what were they to do? This was King Louis XIV, the most powerful and influential man in the world. I think it's indisputable at this point that King Louis XIV of France belongs in that great man club, perhaps even alongside the Trinity, Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon. Will and Ariel Durant describe the king, quote, "This was the zenith of the roi Soleil. Not since Charlemagne had France been so extended or so powerful. Immense and costly spectacles celebrated the successes of the Sun King. The Council of Paris officially declared him Louis le Grand. Lebrun painted him as a god on the vaults of Versailles. A theologian argued that Louis's victories proved the existence of God. The populace idealized its ruler and took pride in his apparent invincibility. Leibniz hailed him as that great prince who is the acknowledged glory of our time. All educated Europe began to speak his language and imitate his court, his arts, his ways. The sun was high. End quote. Will and Ariel Durant always chose their words with care. It's part of what I love about them. There's a poetry to their writing not found in modern histories. And when they said that this was the zenith of the Roi Soleil, of the Sun King, that's not a mistake. When the sun is at its zenith, at the highest point in the sky, what does that mean? Yes, it has spent all morning rising and sent all shadows into hiding. However, once the sun is at its zenith, it must inevitably begin its decline. For the past few weeks, I've asked you to imagine yourself in the shoes of a young French sailor, mostly during the civil unrest of the Fronde. That imaginary sailor was a Huguenot from the coast of France, probably somewhere in his late teens, but I was fairly vague about the specifics. Today we're going to paint a much clearer picture of our sailor, his story, his family, his lifestyle, and his politics. And then a hard left into the King of France's love life, and one woman's influence on our imaginary characters and all of the pirates. This is episode 148, Femme Fatale. To begin, let's give our sailor a hometown. Maybe not the place of his birth, there are a ton of small towns on the Atlantic coast of France, but his home base. The city of La Rochelle is an important port city in France, even today. It lies on the Bay of Biscay and has long been an important part of France's many naval conflicts with the Spanish. La Rochelle is old, but it's not really old, as far as French and European cities in general are reckoned. It doesn't go back to Romano Gaul, as do many French cities. Atlantic traffic wasn't that important to the Romans. Now there was some out of Spain, but it was mostly centered in the Mediterranean. But as the Middle Ages marched on, when, say, the Duke of Normandy conquered England, and then a bit later when France fought the 100 Years' War, the port of La Rochelle grew in size and importance. And when the Age of Sail arrived, La Rochelle became one of the most important cities in the nation. It was important economically and militarily. However, as a cosmopolitan city, a place that attracted a lot of outside influence, as many port cities do, La Rochelle became kind of a center for heretics. During the French Wars of Religion, for example, La Rochelle became almost a capital for Huguenot France. Now, the Edict of Nantes secured for the Huguenots most of the rights that Catholics in France enjoyed. Not all of the rights, but many of them. Beyond that, it granted legal protection for French citizens while traveling abroad from the Inquisition. Perhaps most important to our story, the edict defended La Rochelle's status as a sanctuary city. A city that would accept Protestant refugees from other countries around Europe. Now, the king's support was pretty tepid, admittedly. Mostly, Henry didn't try to stop La Rochelle from being a sanctuary city, but even that was worth something. However, that did make La Rochelle a center of Huguenot power. And in 1630, that did backfire a bit. While the 30 Years' War was raging in Germany, the Huguenots in La Rochelle revolted against King Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu, which I have been pronouncing incorrectly. It's Richelieu, not Richelieu. But of course that gives us the famous Siege of La Rochelle, in which Richelieu blockaded the city. Our imaginary sailor probably was not alive for the Siege of La Rochelle, but his parents would have been. It's not impossible to imagine a scenario in which our sailor's mother was pregnant with him, where his father was fighting in the war and even killed. That's the kind of thing that would hang over a young man's life. It would inform his decisions and mold his politics. So you come from that Huguenot family. You're not rich or powerful, but you're not serfs either. You're working class, but doing okay. As a Calvinist Protestant, you probably have some anti-monarchist leanings. You might even have some radical Republican ideas, but you're not a philosopher. You're a sailor. Your only real goal is to get out to sea as your father did before you, before he was, of course, tragically killed. Still, that would put you squarely in the pro-Fronde anti-Mazzeran camp. And that's how you found yourself, as we discussed, as a member of a ship's crew, sitting in a dockside tavern, toasting the Republican Declaration of the Frondeur. But even with all of that, there's a very good possibility that you would support the new king, the young and handsome and charismatic King Louis XIV. He was just about your age, maybe a couple of years younger, but in the same range. And King Louis was an admirable person, in a way that might be confusing to the modern mind. You know, we measure our potential leaders on how much we would like to have a beer with them. But the people of early modern France, well, they might feel the same way about their local magistrates, but not the king. The king should be having his beers with God, or at the very least with the Pope. He should be glorious and awesome in all of the old-fashioned sense of those words, what Will Durant called the half-unconscious belief in the divine right of kings. And King Louis had that. He had mystique, and he exuded an aura of power, and above all, he had that sense of grandeur. But make no mistake, Louis worked hard to keep that image up. Most of the biographers I've read, especially the more modern biographers of King Louis, agree that, well, while he enjoyed the perks of his semi-divine status, he was under no illusion as to the reality of the situation. He was a hard-working executive. He was an administrator, and that was the job he did. But he also took seriously his position as the symbol of heavenly support for his nation, and he worked hard to keep that image up as well. That was Louis's propaganda, while behind the scenes he was doing the less sexy work of politics. But it's possible, even likely, that you and your fellow Huguenot sailors with mild Republican leanings would still have high hopes for the young king, and some of those hopes would have been realized, at least at first. The economy of France was booming to start, and instead of concentrating it all at the very top, which is what would happen later, that economy did trickle down a bit. The very poor continued to be very poor, but the middle class was growing, and you and most of your Huguenot friends were among that group. But even the poor were a bit better off. There were infrastructure improvements and a few social safety nets. Not, a lot. It wasn't a welfare state. People were still starving to death on a large scale, but there were royal orphanages, and there were corn doles in some of the bigger cities. It was a bit better for everyone. So maybe this King Louis was going to work out, even, potentially, for the Huguenots. From the time in 1661, when Cardinal Mazzeran died, from that moment until about 1678, the conclusion of the Franco-Dutch War, when France and Louis stood at the pinnacle of the political and military mountain of Europe, During that whole time, the Edict of Nantes that protected your people stayed firmly in place, and throughout all of that, our Huguenot sailors prospered. So who were these Huguenot sailors from La Rochelle? Much like the Spanish Biscayers, the French privateers in the Bay of Biscay were among the best in the world. These Huguenot sailors would have been aware of the colony of outlaw heretic poacher pirates on the other side of the world, the Buccaneers over in Tortuga, and a few probably thought about making their way over there. A few probably did. News of pirates like Francois L'Olonnais and Henry Morgan, talk of the Brethren of the Coast and their much more Republican ideals would have been attractive. But most of the sailors there wouldn't have, at least not until the war began to get really heated. A large number of French nationals sailed west, got their letters of marque, and fought in the war. Now, by that point, Tortuga was the hive of scum and villainy with which we are all familiar. Just the place that you, a young sailor searching for all kinds of vice, would have loved. But let's look at the makeup of the ships on which most of our Huguenot sailors served. Most merchant ships were privately owned family businesses. Not the giant multinational East India Company ships, but those who sailed for ports in the Netherlands and England and Spain and Italy and traded goods at every port along the way. That was a small business. Those on board would have been working alongside their brothers and their cousins and their extended family. Your training, your apprenticeship, was probably with your father. Unless he had been tragically killed, then it would be with an uncle or some other close relative. And when your nation went to war, the family had to make a decision. Should you accept a commission and go out privateering? Should you take your ship, which was relatively well armed? You had to defend against the Spanish and those Barbary pirates after all. But should you put that ship in harm's way? It was a very real money-making opportunity that most families had to at least consider. Of course, should that ship decide to sail west, they didn't sail with the whole family. They left the younger men behind, a few of the older men behind. They took the hale and healthy in the family. To fill those empty spots, they took some of the rougher sort around town, those who could be found drunk in taverns in the middle of the day, but those who knew how to handle themselves in a fight. Those who usually stayed in a place like Tortuga and went on to become the pirates. Given that information, considering that these ships were a family business more often than not, it probably wasn't that easy to sneak off for a bit of drunken debauchery, if, say, your uncle was looking over your shoulder, unless you had the sort of uncle who was there alongside you. Now, these were privateers. They were not pirates. So upon the war's end, after making a boatload of money, they went home. They took that money and invested it into land and back into the community. It was a good thing for them, especially since, at this point, most of our privateers, our imaginary Huguenot sailors, were getting a bit older. Those who remembered the Fronde and led many of the privateer vessels during the war were nearing 50 by the end of the Dutch War. Now that's not exactly elderly, but if they had the money to do so, and many of them earned that money in the war, they stopped sailing. They didn't retire, exactly. They went fishing or did other jobs in the family business, but they sent their sons in their place. Adult sons who, at this point, had small children of their own, who stayed there at home with their grandparents. And of course, that's not always how it happened. Life is a complicated mess, but that is a possible, or perhaps even typical, family cycle for a young mariner born around the end of the Franco-Dutch War, which, remember, was a large international conflict that involved a lot of countries beyond the French and the Dutch, the English, the Spanish, a bunch of Germans. that was the kind of war that saw a lot of men serving far from home for many years who, when the war ended, all came back. The early 1680s give us a bit of a baby boom. We're talking about France today, but this was happening in all of the colonial Atlantic powers. Now, the pirates who are going to concern us in the weeks and months to come are from that middle generation who are at sea right now. We've met a bunch of them already. Dampier and Lauro de Graaf and Ravenel de Lussan and John Reed. Basically everyone in that latter buccaneer era. Their kids, those small children born in that baby boom, well, they're not important yet, but put a pin in that. In everything that's about to happen, they should be in the back of your mind. Remember that all of the big names in Caribbean piracy, Benjamin Hornigold and Edward Teach, Labuse for a French touch, and Anne Bonny and Mary Read and Calico Jack, all of them, all of the most famous pirates that operated out of Nassau, were born right about 1680, in that post-Franco-Dutch War baby boom. So our privateer Huguenot sailors with Republican leanings, so recently returned from war and relatively flush with cash, were living in what I can only assume was domestic bliss there on the Atlantic coast. I picture the opening scene of Inglourious Bastards, my favorite Tarantino movie, only with a seaside vista in the background. And much like that humble but happy home in France in the 1940s, surely nothing bad could ever happen to them. That is, until, naturally, something bad did happen to them. This is the point where we have to switch gears to look at why something bad happened to them. And that, of course, concerns the King of France. Much like our imaginary Huguenots, King Louis was getting older. He was indisputably the most powerful monarch in Europe, but the excess, the beauty of his youth was beginning to fade. The fashion, for example, of wearing one's hair in natural curls was giving way to powdered wigs again. Certainly not because the French king's hair was beginning to gray, and God forbid thin. It was just a coincidence of fashion. The balls and dances once so common in the court were giving way to opera and plays and other activities that allowed the viewers to sit down for a change and, should the need arise, to take a clandestine nap. The wine was watered more and more. The beautiful young women by the king's bedside were replaced by priests, and, even more shocking, replaced by the king's wife. Now, that wife was not Maria Theresa, the Infanta of Spain. That marriage had never been a marriage of love, though Louis did demand that the queen be showed the utmost respect by his court, even, perhaps especially, by his mistresses. However, Maria Theresa died in 1683. She had only given the king one child who lived to adulthood, and that was Louis, le Grand Dauphin. He wouldn't ever become king, his son would, though, but in that respect, and maybe only in that respect, the union between King Louis and Maria Theresa was a success. But outside of his marriage, we don't know how many lovers Louis had. We don't even know how many children the king had. Gardeners and nurses and chambermaids and cooks and all manner of servants in the Palais Royal had a bunch of illegitimate children. Now, of course, they weren't all the king's children. There were a ton of handsome chevaliers in the court, but the king did pay for most of them. At a certain point, those royal orphanages which the king opened were just good financial sense. King Louis's acknowledged mistresses we can name, as well as most of their children. We won't do so. This show can only be so long, but between 1660 and here in the early 1680s, King Louis had at least 15 children with at least 6 different women. And those were only the women and children worthy of note. Now, most of those children were legitimized and given minor noble titles. Some of them even went on to practice roles in the military or governance of France, and some of them were very successful. But we do need to talk about the last 2 of Louis's mistresses. They are important to our story. Do you remember Nell Gwynn? She was that English Protestant actress and mistress of Charles II of England. Admiral Pepys called her pretty, witty Nell. I bring her up here because, in the eyes of many people in England, Nell Gwynn was the proper queen. However, in the eyes of many others in England, Nell Gwynn was evil incarnate, a woman who used her many charms to seduce the king away from what they saw as the righteous path. That's an ancient trope in the Western literary canon. It dates back to well before the Bible, but we see a lot of it in the Bible. It was around this time, a little bit later, but the same era, when in French literature we first see the term for this trope arise, la femme fatale. And very much like Nell Gwynn, King Louis's favorite mistress during the 1670s was considered by some the real Queen of France. Now, in her case, it was less because the people liked her and more because of her influence at court. However, unlike Nell Gwynn, Françoise Athena, Madame de Montespan, may have earned her reputation as the consummate femme fatale. Montespan was stunningly beautiful. She had big blue eyes and curls that, depending on the light, could shift from amber to auburn. She had fair, smooth skin and, reportedly, cheeks that never needed rouge. In short, Montespan was the kind of woman that, she was the kind of woman that looked like she had been designed by a man. And that's to say nothing of her figure, which is the very first thing that everybody who wrote about her mentions. I don't know enough synonyms for the word voluptuous to properly describe her. I mean, there are priests who just met this woman that were suddenly like those cartoon wolves with their eyes bulging out of their skulls. This woman was impressive. And it's hard to say how much of that is the fact that she was a favored mistress of the king. I'm going to take a stab in the dark and say thousands of glowing descriptions of Montespan's beauty might be an attempt to get into the king's good graces, but I don't think they were. I think that this woman was as beautiful as all of the people that wrote about her make her out to be. Now, the Madame de Montespan met King Louis at a ball in 1666. She danced with the king, and she impressed the king. Perhaps more than anything, what impressed Louis was that she rebuffed his advances. See, the Madame de Montespan was not only beautiful, she was very, very smart, and she was very ambitious. She used her intelligence to ingratiate herself into the court. Montespan's first job at the court was as an attendant to the Queen Mother. However, the Queen Mother recommended her services to a younger woman, the Queen Maria Theresa, who recommended her services to the king's most favored mistress at the time. She worked for the 3 most powerful women in France, and all of them were deeply impressed with her. The mistress was so impressed that she invited the Madame de Montespan to attend dinners between herself and the king. Imagine Louis's surprise when he shows up to dinner with his mistress and this stunningly beautiful woman who rebuffed his advances a few months earlier was there as well. It didn't take long before the Madame de Montespan had her own chambers in the royal apartments connected to Louis's. From that point, it took almost no time before she wielded a surprising amount of power there in the court. A suspicious amount of power, even. And Louis tried to be gracious to his other women, but it was clear at this point that he was smitten with the Madame de Montespan. The wildest theories about her influence on the king were, it wasn't uncommon to hear it said that La Madame de Montespan was a witch who, it is known, regularly engaged in sexual congress with the devil himself. It was also said that her stunning beauty was nothing more than a glamour intended to entice the most Christian monarch into satanic rituals of otherworldly passion. These accusations were, for the most part, brushed off as the erotic fantasies of repressed conspiracy theorists, which is what they were. However, they were given a lot more credence after something that is known as l'affaire des poissons, or the affair of the poisons. That was a scandal that gripped Paris and France at large in a very real terror of witchcraft and unholy power. An aristocratic French woman was accused of murdering her father and 2 older brothers by means of a deadly poison. That woman confessed to the crime, but she did so under torture, so we can't verify the validity of the confession or of her motives. Most people assumed that the murders were a bid to claim the inheritance from her father that would have gone to her brothers. And had it all ended there, she would have been burned at the stake and forgotten. But before her execution, that aristocratic noblewoman began to name names. She exposed what appears to have been an occult underbelly there in Paris. Now, this sort of thing should not shock us. The aristocracy love this kind of stuff, sex and blood and dark magic. It's all very eyes wide shut. But the investigations that followed that woman's confession uncovered as many as 2,500 alleged murders. At least, suspicious deaths. All of those murders were by poison, and all of them stemmed from a cabal, or let's just call it what it was, a coven of women there in Paris. The 2 women at the top of that conspiracy, at least the 2 most prominent women who were accused, had earlier in their lives married merchants who died of suspicious illnesses and passed their fortunes on to their widows. And those widows, those 2 women and their acolytes, got involved in the salons there in Paris. They befriended some of the more influential and highest paid courtesans. They became pillars of the community of a sort, and then they opened businesses. Now, those businesses offered goods and services that were necessary to the women of Paris. They offered clandestine and safe abortion. They offered birth control. They had rudimentary protection from STDs. They had herbs that would ease menstruation pains. They offered midwifery. That was the kind of thing you see everywhere. However, some of those women also offered fortune-telling and sorcery. They held seances and black masses, and they sold potions and poisons. Now, the poisons were the real concern here. They were linked to the deaths of thousands of powerful men, but the panic, what really gripped the people, naturally, was the witchcraft. Now, it's not a new idea to point out that this panic and the hundreds of other panics like it we see in the ancient world have a lot more to do with feminine power and the agency of women than, the devil. Witches all throughout history have given women necessary and safe medical care, the kind of care that they couldn't receive from doctors, and at this point would not receive from doctors for at least 200 years. They provided places of safety and comfort for women in dangerous situations, and for women who had been forced into abusive and even potentially life-threatening marriages, they offered a way out: poison. What we need to realize about this particular group of witches is that, in addition to the herbs and the midwifery and other services, they did offer seances and black masses. They did sell their potions and their sorcery. No, of course, none of that was real. That was just something that rich aristocratic women were willing to pay a huge amount of money for. Sure, say some magic words, collect a giant bag of coin. Who wouldn't? But the poison was real, and they sold that as well. And that brings us to the most high-profile woman implicated in this coven of dark magic. La Madame de Montespan allegedly purchased love potions and even mind control potions from these witches. And, if we can believe her accusers, more than once La Madame de Montespan engaged in black mass on the grounds of the Palais Royal, right under the nose of the most Christian king, all of it to control him. The image of this famous, voluptuous, fiery redhead stripping down and dancing nude around a fire was a popular one there in Paris. The rumors circulated, even writings and a few pictures of the event. I'm frankly pretty fond of the idea myself, but it really shook King Louis XIV. He took it very seriously. He justifiably was quite concerned about poison. 2,500 noblemen dead in the past decade? Yeah, he got some food tasters. In addition to that, he distanced himself from what he seems to have. Well, I don't want to say that he believed that Montespan was a witch, but, well, we all know one of those women who's really into tarot and astrology and sacred geometry and, magic potions, right? She probably can't put a curse on you, but isn't it better to be safe than sorry? Louis was disturbed by the reports of black masses, and though he didn't exactly throw Montespan out of the castle, he made it clear that she was no longer welcome. In the politest way possible, of course. It was at this point that Louis began to noticeably abstain from some of the more sinful indulgences that he had enjoyed in his youth. This is when he began to gravitate more and more toward God. The Gallic Church had always been an influential organization, but at this point, Louis began to promote his confessors and his bishops and even common priests and the nunneries. They became powerful institutions with the backing of the king. He was retreating from his sins into religion. In a lot of ways, the young King Louis followed in the grand tradition of those Frankish monarchs of old, those from the Merovingian dynasty. Those monarchs had been very fond of war and very good at it. Louis was as well. Those monarchs had engaged in concubinage, as did Louis, and when they eventually did adopt Catholicism, they did so in a self-serving fashion, a cynical fashion, to control the people more than from legitimate belief. But after his brush with the satanic rites of those women in his court, Louis appears to have begun to truly believe in all of it, from the divine right of kings all the way down. Now, Louis, despite his image as the most Christian king, was in his youth not very good at the whole Catholic thing. He knew the forms, but not the theory. However, it's about this time that Louis once again took a wife. He did so in a secret ceremony, a ceremony that denied his wife any claim to royal privilege. She would not be the queen, merely the wife of Louis Bourbon. And it appears that that's what she really wanted. His new bride was quiet and pious and intelligent. I think, though, most important to our story, she really loved the king. And when I say his wife was often at his bedside, this is who I mean, La Marquise de Maintenon. She changed King Louis. Will and Ariel Durant wrote of their union, quote, "It was the king's best and happiest union, the only one whose vows he appears to have kept. It had taken him almost half a century to discover that to be loved is worth monogamy." End quote. So the king, after his brush with the devil, was settling down and growing more religious. This is a good point to pause and look at where we are in the story of piracy, the overall story of piracy. At this moment, over in the West Indies, Governor Henry Morgan was outfitting a pirate hunter to hunt down specifically Lauro de Graaf or Michel de Grammont. Down to the south, John Coxon and Peter Harris and Bartholomew Sharp and William Dampier and that whole lot, they were involved in the first Pacific adventure. But the next thing that we should talk about in the life of Louis XIV and the pirates, well, I'm just going to skip it. We did an entire episode about the War of the Reunions back in episode 54. I will, though, give a very brief recap because it is important. The heirs of Count Dracula and Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan, under the flag of the Ottoman Empire, conquered Hungary and invaded Austria, the seat of the Habsburg Empire, remember, and the Ottoman Empire was winning. France, who notoriously had very good relations with the Ottomans that dated back to Barbarossa and the Barbary pirates, France took that opportunity to move on Habsburg targets in the west, Flanders and the Rhineland. They were Spanish Habsburg territories, but closely linked to the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Alliance that was formed to defend against the Ottomans, that included Germany and Italy and Poland and Russia and Austria, an alliance that Louis was invited to but declined to join. That Holy Alliance defeated the Ottomans at the gates of Vienna in the largest cavalry charge in history. It's quite a story. Catholic Europe at this point stood proudly against the invaders, victorious at last. And when they turned around, they found King Louis XIV kind of like walking in on a guilty dog with his jaws wrapped around the Rhineland. That's a bad look for the king. Everyone was mad at King Louis. Now, what does all of this have to do with pirates in general and our imaginary Huguenot sailors? What do poison and conspiracy and sexy witches and cavalry charges have to do with pirates in the West Indies? Well, there is a connection, and that is manifested in the person of King Louis. The most Christian king was caught in a web of witchcraft and satanic rites. Then, in the War of the Reunions, he was caught with his hand in the Habsburg cookie jar while failing to aid his Catholic brothers against the Ottoman invaders. Louis needed some good press. He needed some goodwill from his Catholic base. He needed to reestablish his bona fides with the Catholic population of France. He married that woman who he appears to have genuinely loved, who aided him in his salvation. But Louis chose to earn the respect of his Catholic people by following the example of another old Frankish ruler, this time a Carolingian king, the Carolingian king, Charlemagne. The tradition that Louis chose to emulate was conversion by the sword. I enjoy those old wartime broadcasts that they used to show before movies back in the 40s, and the World War II radio bulletins. Both of them have this character that really just gets my patriotic engines revving. I seriously considered doing the whole episode today in that style. Welcome to the Pirate History News Hour, brought to you by cigarettes, asbestos, and lead paint. Lead paint, good to the last drop. First up, headlines. Victory. In the War of the Three Emperors, German Emperor Leo and Tsar Peter punched the Sultan in the jaw at the gates of Vienna. The Turks are in full retreat, chased across Hungary into the mountains of Transylvania. Hello, Ivan. Betrayal. French King Louis used the fighting in the east to snap up land in Flanders. This act of aggression angered many on the continent. Looks like Louis is in a real pickle. Most of his allies have abandoned him, everyone except his close friend, Charles of England. I can see the egg on old Louis's face from here. I really wanted to do a whole episode of that, but I'll spare you and my vocal cords. Regardless, Louis was in a difficult situation. He endured l'affaire des Poissons and the subsequent witchcraft panic in his court, and then he suffered all of that bad press from the War of the Reunions. Catholic Europe was unhappy with Louis. Well, everyone was, but the Catholics in particular. So Louis bid to reclaim the goodwill he felt he deserved through a policy of conversion by the sword. This is episode 149. War! Oppression! French King Louis, in a bid to secure his tenuous hold on power, unleashed a campaign of terror against his Huguenot minority. And that's it, I promise. For now. Given the World War II tone that I've set up here, I do want to couch this next bit very carefully. I'm in no way comparing what the Huguenot population in France in the 1680s went through to what the Jewish people went through in the Holocaust. What I am doing, and what a lot of reputable historians have done as well, is comparing what the Huguenots went through to what the Jews went through in post-Reconquista Spain, beginning in 1492, that policy of pogrom and inquisition that forcibly converted or expelled all of the Sephardi Jews from Spain. There are a ton of differences between those two stories, both in the tactics used and in the response, but we'll get to those in a second. First, I want to highlight the similar role that both minority groups played within their respective societies. Let's say that you're the monarch of a deeply stratified, feudalistic kingdom. The aristocracy rules everything, but you sit at the very top. And then there's this huge, uneducated peasant underclass that does all the labor. They do it because there is a small group of priests in the middle that tell them that all of this is God's plan. Now that's the medieval, feudal model. That's the model upon which the French three estates are built. And of course we all know how that would end up. In that model, though, you will eventually find a need for an educated middle class. You know, those people who would be doctors and accountants and merchants, jobs that the church really wasn't positioned to do and that the aristocracy wouldn't do. It's hard to convince hundreds of thousands of serfs to live in perpetual destitution when they see those well-fed, happy middle-class families. The only way to do so is to assure that peasant underclass that those middle-class people aren't going to heaven. Naturally, though, should your rule find itself on shaky footing, the very best idea is to blame it on those literate, professional merchants and doctors, and then chase them out of your country, because that sort of thing never backfires, except, of course it will, and it always did. Back in Spain, when the Jews were expelled, it had serious repercussions on the education and economy of the Spanish, and here, in 1681, it was going to do so again. Now, the Edict of Nantes was still in full effect in France. It legally protected all of the rights that the Huguenots, who, remember, had just returned from fighting in the Dutch War, it protected all of the rights they enjoyed. But Louis was beginning to pull back from the Edict of Nantes. He adopted a policy known as cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion. That's an old Roman principle that was originally intended to promote religious tolerance. You know, Roman provincials were allowed to practice whatever religion their realm followed, as long as they said a prayer for the emperor. That's something that the early Christians famously refused to do. But Louis used that principle to promote religious intolerance. His realm, his religion. Initially, Louis began his persecution of the Huguenots in a fashion that was technically within the bounds of the Edict of Nantes. The most visible form that this early anti-Huguenot action took was in the housing of dragoons exclusively in Huguenot homes. Back in civics class, when we were learning about the U.S. Constitution, I was confused by the Third Amendment. That's the amendment that prohibits the housing of soldiers in private homes. This was not much of a problem back when I was attending civics class, but it was a problem in the early modern world. They called the practice billeting, a French word originally. This was an old practice. And it didn't have to be horrible. It could, and often was, innocuous. When medieval armies on the march billeted in the castles of friendly regional lords, it was just the norm. That's what the castle system was for. But it could be a violent tool of war as well. When medieval lords billeted their armies in the castles of rebellious regions, that was an aggressive act. There was a military aspect to that, obviously. There was an army on your land, and they could keep rebellious forces from organizing with the threat or the use of force. And that's often how it went. But there was also a civil aspect. The civilians in the surrounding regions and their physical safety were often the leverage that kept those rebellious forces at bay. The soldiers didn't have to risk their lives fighting rebellious armies. No, they could just ensure that the people would suffer if those armies were raised. Sometimes those soldiers took liberties with the citizens' food stores. We're talking about eating all of their grain and potatoes, eating all of the food that was intended to feed them all winter. This could be a serious problem. And sometimes those billeted soldiers would beat the locals or conscript the young men into the army. Neither of those things were good either, and sometimes people died. But then there was the inevitable sexual violence. And were you one of those people who was involved in a potential rebellion, the prospect of the forcible and often public rape of either yourself or one of your family members was very likely enough to get you to think twice. And then, by the Renaissance or so, all of those castles had given way to palaces and chateaux and large rural estates. So instead of billeted soldiers living in the regional lord's castle, they stayed in the homes of the civilians. All of that potential abuse, which was once a public and purposeful force for putting a rebellious population down, was now a private and deeply personal, and often, because no one else was watching, often a much worse form of abuse. Now, billeting in general was a controversial tactic. At least I should say it was controversial when it was used against white people. No one seemed to mind billeting when it was a colonized population of brown people across the world. Some priests and philosophers, sure, but no one who could do anything about it. But when it was a group of God-fearing Europeans, well, it just didn't look good. But then again, King Louis of France was all about controversy. In his campaign against the Huguenots, Louis used a police force, a military internal police force called the Dragoons. We call this policy of billeting them in Huguenot households the Dragonnades. The Dragoons were mounted musketeers. They were kind of a mobile infantry. They didn't fight on horseback. They just rode their horses into place and got in line to fight. They were France's only real standing army, and they were deeply loyal to the king. That's why Louis chose to use them in his abuses of the Huguenots. Now, while the billeting aspect was technically legal, the abuses that they inflicted upon the Huguenots, none of that was legal. And they did all of that stuff we just talked about, the eating of food, the beating, the conscription, and the rape, only they dialed it all up to 11. However, as horrible and illegal as all of that was, what were the people to do here? Who do you call when the internal police force are the criminals? And, those soldiers who did the worst abuses might get chewed out by their superiors, but they didn't get fired. They didn't get arrested or punished. This was the policy. An unofficial policy, sure, but those dragoons were always just shuffled off to some other Huguenot household where they could leave another swath of broken lives in their wake. It's debatable whether or not this is the case, but many people at the time said that those dragoons who were the worst behaved, who committed the worst offenses against their Huguenot hosts, were shuffled off to the best homes. The richest homes with the prettiest daughters where they could do the most damage. Were you a Huguenot that wanted to avoid all of that horror? You wanted your money and property and food and family to stay safe. There was a simple answer to all of that. All you had to do was convert. Become a Catholic. The king is only billeting dragoons in Huguenot households. If you agree to convert to Catholicism, the soldiers would leave your pantry and your wife and your family unmolested. That's the route that a lot of Huguenots took. much like many of the Jews back in Spain in the 1490s. Also, like many of those Jewish people, many of the Huguenots just lied about it. Yep, we sure are Catholic. Good to be with you. Others, though, were unwilling to convert, even falsely. Some of those hid their food and their women away so that there was virtually nothing for those Huguenot soldiers to do except openly kill them. Some, a foolish few, fought. They lost those fights, but that was really causing problems for the king. Problems in the optics of this whole operation. The Dragonades were an effective system of conversion by the sword, but imperfect. The optics looked bad, and it left the Huguenots a lot of wiggle room. And that was all the fault of that pesky Edict of Nantes. That's why, in 1685, King Louis promulgated the Edict of Fontainebleau. That was an edict that repealed Nantes. It removed all of the legal protections for the Huguenot population of France. All of the rights that we take for granted in the modern world were just gone on one day in October of 1685. The freedom of religion, obviously, gone. Louis ordered all Huguenot churches burned to the ground, every last one of them. Catholicism had always been the state religion, but now it was the only religion. How about freedom of assembly? I like that one. Well, that was gone too. Neither protests nor religious congregations for the Huguenots were allowed, and oftentimes those protests and congregations were one and the same. Do you remember, back when we talked about the Glorious Revolution, Argyll's rebellion up in Scotland? There were those groups of Scottish Covenanters who gathered in congregations of armed parishioners to hear sermons of royal oppression from the Bible. The Huguenots in France did much the same thing, and were doing so at almost exactly the same time. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what they call foreshadowing. But how about the freedoms of speech and the press? Well, the army arrested any Huguenots that spoke out because they had no freedom to speak. Any Huguenots that owned a printing press had that press liberated by the king's army for royal needs, and then were often executed on the spot for publishing seditious materials. It was a good old-fashioned religious cleansing. In the face of all of that, the Huguenots took what was really the only option remaining to them. They left. They went everywhere, almost everywhere. A lot of Huguenots, those that were rich enough to afford a decent piece of land, or those that were so poor that they had to sell themselves into servitude, a lot of them sailed west. Those were the Huguenots who established cities in the colonies, very much like Cap Français there in Haiti, those who established that city and then fought alongside Lauro de Graff and Anjou Lavaux and Michel-André Zun. But Germany also welcomed a ton of exiles, thanks mostly to a deeply and perhaps even zealously Calvinist leader there called Friedrich William. He was the Great Elector of Brandenburg and the Duke of Prussia, generally called the Great Elector of Brandenburg-Prussia. He promulgated the Edict of Potsdam, which accepted any Huguenot refugees that made their way to his lands. Denmark and Sweden, and really most of Protestant Europe, also welcomed any Huguenots that could make their way there, with one big exception. That country is a territory that we might assume would welcome as many Calvinist Huguenots as possible. I'm of course talking about the Netherlands, a Calvinist country. But there were very few French people who were willing to step foot into the Netherlands, and most of the Dutch didn't want any French people doing so anyway. There was a lot of bad blood there that went back for some time. Remember when all of those Sephardi Jews fled Spain and Spain really began to suffer? When all of the educated, literate doctors and merchants and artisans, when they went elsewhere to England or Portugal or in large numbers to the Ottoman Empire and the Netherlands, and all of those other countries really prospered from their presence. Well, that was happening again here in France. Wait, what is that? Brain drain. French King Louis celebrated Christmas this year at his Versailles resort. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of France's best and brightest were chased out of their homes by jack-booted dragoon troopers. So much for goodwill toward men, am I right? Across the creek, the docks swarmed with Englishmen eager to welcome their Protestant brothers with food and beer and good cheer. Now that's what I call a Merry Christmas. I really like that voice. But all of those architects and mathematicians and physicists, I mean, there was one guy in France, a Huguenot, who was at the time studying steam power. I mean, he lost years of work when he was persecuted by the dragoons and then forced to leave his work behind when he fled to England and then on to Germany. Imagine what we might have had if he had had those lost years, some of the best years of his life, to work his hardest. I mean, we might have a steam-powered Queen Anne's Revenge with a steampunk Blackbeard. He might have, a hydraulic peg leg and a mega gun. It would be amazing, but we didn't have any of that because King Louis of France had to get scared of a bunch of hot, fake witches. It's disgusting. However, that's speculation. Speculation I enjoy, but speculation nonetheless. See, there's a lot of debate over the Huguenot exodus and the demographics involved. And we'll talk about the colonial and piratical implications when we talk about Florida and Mississippi and Louisiana, and perhaps most prescient to our story moving forward, the Cape of Good Hope and Madagascar. For now, though, we're talking about England. European problems concern us today. Those Huguenots made their way across the Channel to English shores. This happened almost exclusively in 1685 and early 1686. The King of England, Charles II, had just died. His brother, James II, was an unapologetic Catholic. As many as 500,000 Huguenots made their way to England, and to many of them, King James' actions there in England looked a hell of a lot like what had happened to them back in France. And it's really not fair to compare King James' actions to King Louis's Huguenot persecution. I mean, James wasn't great by any stretch of the imagination. Look at the Scottish killing time, for example. But most historians agree that James wasn't trying to cleanse his country. He was merely promoting the interests of English Catholics. And I personally believe in the freedom of religion. I despise the very idea of a state religion. After all, one of my favorite Englishmen of all time, J.R.R. Tolkien, was super Catholic and super English, and I think that's wonderful. But the English Protestants of the late 1600s were not nearly so accepting. They were angry about King James and his religion, and they were also scared. Those fears were enhanced by the arrival of the Huguenots, who had horror stories from their homes of what King Louis, a close personal friend of King James, had done to them. We couldn't say that the Huguenots were behind the movement to topple King James II. Mostly that was a bunch of English nobles, but they certainly lent their voices to the clamor. They told stories of royal Catholic oppression and never failed to remind everyone of how James grew up in France and took communion whenever he was in France, and how his sister was a Catholic married to Louis's own brother. Of course, the English didn't need much reminding of that, but the Huguenots became something of a lightning rod for the English revolutionaries in the lead-up to the Glorious Revolution. And I don't imagine that most of those French people were all that excited when William of Orange, a Dutchman, a leader in the Netherlands, sailed over and took the throne from James. But even a Dutch king was better than a Catholic like Louis. It's truly unfortunate that we don't have the recollections of one particular writer when he arrived in England into all of this chaos. William Dampier, our old friend, arrived back in England shortly after all of this took place. However, he ends his narrative in his ship-bound voyage into the Channel. He does mention the Dutch ships that he saw, which confused him, but doesn't give his opinion on the state of politics at the time. You know how when you go on a vacation and then come back, there's this sense of, whiplash as you return to the reality of everyday life? Imagine that, only instead of, a couple of weeks vacation, it's been 13 years since you've been home. Of course, Dampier had his own problems. He'd had a wife that he'd barely met, and he had no money, but he did have the makings of a great book. However, everything had changed so much in the time that he had been gone. King Charles, dead, King James, deposed, and the Dutch Prince of Orange, William, was now sitting on the throne alongside his wife, King James' daughter, Mary. But what I imagine shocked Dampier the most is how close everyone seemed to be to war. The alliances that were formed in the wake of Louis's persecution of the Huguenots and the Glorious Revolution were a complex affair. The complexity stems mainly from the fact that the Holy Roman Empire wasn't really a thing. It didn't really exist. There was an imperial diet that, alongside the emperor, of course, had the power to make decisions of war and alliance for the whole of the empire. But I think of them kind of like the UN. There were too many forces at play in the empire that were often at odds with each other to really get anything done on an imperial level. The two main forces in the empire were split between two families, one of them Catholic and one of them Protestant. The first of these was the Austrian Habsburgs, of course, the Catholic powerhouse in Europe, of which the Holy Roman Emperor, Leo I, was a member. But then, on the other side, there were the Prussians, who we met earlier in the person of the Grand Elector Friedrich William, Duke of Prussia. Friedrich William was a member of the House of Hohenzollern, the same noble house that would give rise to the German Empire in 1871, the same that led the Second Reich and led Germany into World War I. The roots of what would become of the Holy Roman Empire, the split between the Germans under the Hohenzollerns and the Austro-Hungarians under the Habsburgs, that can be found in this war, and they can be defined mostly by those alliances that were so complex. The first alliance we need to mention is the Holy League. We've talked about them already. That was the alliance between Russia and Austria and Poland, as well as, parts of Hungary and Bohemia that fought off the Ottoman Empire at the gates of Vienna. Currently, they were embroiled in a war with the Ottomans in Wallachia and Transylvania, the Romanian Crimea, and the other parts of Hungary. That alliance, the Holy League, looked very much poised to crush the Ottoman forces in Eastern Europe. That's why Leopold I, in his role as the Grand Duke of Austria, not as Holy Roman Empire, that's why he felt safe in negotiating another alliance. Not an imperial alliance, but an Austrian alliance. And this second coalition is much more important to our story moving forward. That is the Grand Alliance between Leopold I of Austria and William of Orange and of England. England and the Netherlands, under William, were allied with Austria against their common enemy, King Louis of France. Now, Louis, always a canny leader, saw this state of affairs, realized he was in a tight spot, and engaged in some behind-the-scenes negotiations to secure his borders and peace for his nation. But then,
reversal. In a surprise move, Russian Tsar Peter the Great marched his army into the Crimea, where they ambushed the Turks in a dashing attack. Peter the Great suffered a sound defeat at the hand of the Turk, so in a bold move he marched in another army who took the field. They were also soundly defeated. A classic Russian move, luring their army into a devastating trap with the appearance of a weak and incompetent army. Thousands are dead.
as is the trend for Russian armies, the same trend that we see in the Napoleonic Wars and World War I and World War II, the Russians were starting this war off very poorly. Now, Louis of France, who was, remember, definitely not allied with the Ottoman Empire, Louis changed his tune when Austria was forced to commit their forces in the east to support the Russians. He went from placating his enemies and negotiating a peace deal to preparing for war. He bolstered France's ports and shores. He also put a ton of fresh troops on the border. However, King Louis's 30,000 best troops, led by his eldest son, Louis le Grand Dauphin, marched past those border forts into the Rhineland. Now those troops took a number of cities in a matter of weeks. It was another quick series of victories, as the French were accustomed to. This campaign, in October of 1688, pushed the French frontier all the way to the Rhine, a very defensible position and one that King Louis greatly desired. That's what brought the Germans into the fight. Thus far, it had just been the Grand Alliance, but the Grand Elector of Brandenburg, Duke of Prussia, Friedrich William, and I should point out here that he was basically a king at this point. He was nearly as powerful as Leopold I, and his son would actually be named king in Prussia, although not king of Prussia. Technically, they were still part of the Holy Roman Empire. But Friedrich William organized a third alliance. That alliance was the League of Augsburg. This was a separate coalition, but ideologically aligned to the Grand Alliance and even the Holy League, even though they were almost entirely Protestant. They stood in solidarity in opposition to the French. The forces involved in the League of Augsburg basically included everyone that we might consider part of modern-day Germany, Prussia and Brandenburg, of course, as well as Bavaria and Saxony and the Rhineland. They also added in Denmark and Savoy to their ranks. The arrangement of the armies in November of 1688 looks a lot like the Western Front in November of 1914. The location was different. It was further to the east. The Rhine was the front here, with modern Belgium and Luxembourg, and even a good chunk of modern Germany held by France. But the armies in place were similar, if not exactly the same. In the far north, we have the Dutch army. Slightly to the south, directly below them, we have the German League of Augsburg, led by Prussia. Then, of course, there's neutral Switzerland in the Alpine region, but then south of that, there are the Austrian forces of the Grand Alliance in Italy. But the big difference here, the real wild card in this fight, is England. They were, when James II was in command, supposed to be allied with France, much like they were in World War I. However, thanks to that revolution which took place right before this war broke out, they were fighting against the Bourbons. Now, I say they were fighting, but there really wasn't a ton of fighting when this war initially broke out. Mostly that was thanks to Le Grand Dauphin, the leader of the French forces, King Louis's son. He employed a strategy of non-confrontation. The Grand Dauphin was famously average. He looked much below average when compared to his father. He just wasn't all that bright, but his real strength was in military matters. Now, he wasn't a tactical genius by any means, but he was smart enough not to do anything that would get a ton of men killed, and right now, he found his armies in a situation that might lead to a ton of men getting killed. This was the worst possible situation that Louis and his son might find themselves in. Everybody was allied against them, and that was something for which France had not prepared. So, instead of, standing firm and defending the Rhine, which would inevitably lead to the death of all his men, the French forces chose instead to tear down the walls of the fortresses that they held. They took as much food as they could from the locals and then burned their fields and scorched the Rhineland. This was a scorched earth campaign and a methodical retreat. It was probably the right move, and it bought France quite a bit of time. However, the hammer was still coming. But here's the real question about all of this. Why does any of it matter? Why are we talking about a continental war? What does that have to do with pirates? Why have we spent time talking about King Louis and his lovers and the Huguenots and, the birth of Germany? Why does all of that matter? There are a lot of reasons. Some of them are less tangible, cultural and religious and economic factors that are going to impact the pirates, stuff that we'll touch on in the weeks to come, but most importantly, most directly, there is the colonial question. This war, which would go on to become the 9 Years' War, a war that Europe realized was not going to be the small, quick war that they had anticipated, it was going to engulf the entire world. We need to keep an eye on everything that's happening here. For example, the Ottoman Empire on the Eastern Front and the Red Sea. We're going to need to keep an eye on that because the pirates, some of whom we've already met, are going to become Red Sea men. As a consequence, a direct consequence of this war. The occupation of Madagascar and the pirate haven built there, either Libertalia or St. Mary's, depending on who you ask, that was a consequence of this war. And on down the road, this particular conflict was the primary cause of the War of the Spanish Succession, a war that would employ the Nassau pirates on their way to becoming the most famous and feared force on the high seas. All of these consequences can be traced back to this conflict, the root of which can be largely traced back to one factor, one mentally challenged and physically disabled and invalid factor. A human being with a tail. That is, of course, the bewitched king, Charles II of Spain. Charles was the product of generations of Habsburg inbreeding, and he had no heir. He likely couldn't even produce an heir, but even if he could, he probably shouldn't have. His inability to produce an heir was the main factor in the inheritance clause that was included in Louis XIV's marriage to Maria Theresa. The Habsburgs knew full well that King Charles of Spain would never have a son to take over the throne, and they spent a lot of energy ensuring that they would keep control of the crown of Spain. That's the main point of the Grand Alliance. I mean, there was some territorial stuff in there and the anti-French military alliance, but the real purpose that had very clear and direct language was to secure the throne of Spain for the closest valid Habsburg, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor. There was another, closer Habsburg candidate, but not valid. The very same man who had so recently led French forces into the Rhineland and then, back out, Louis, le Grand Dauphin, the son of Louis XIV and Maria Theresa, was much more closely related to the throne than Leopold I. But, due to that marriage alliance, he was legally barred from the throne. However, everybody knew that King Louis of France had no intention of adhering to that clause, which is why, here in 1688, we see so many alliances against him. Remember that this wasn't just a fight for Spain. That might be enough in itself to justify a war, but the throne of Spain was an imperial throne, and it controlled at this point more territory than any other empire in history ever had. There was Europe, and there was America, and there was Asia, huge, gigantic swaths of land that belonged to Spain. This was the prize of all prizes. That's largely why William of Orange and of England chose to ally himself with his ideological enemy in the Holy Roman Empire. And for his aid in helping to secure a Habsburg victory, both nations, England and the Netherlands, had some vague assurances that they would get their cut. Now, what that cut was isn't exactly defined in the language of the treaty, but it was generally understood to include French America, basically Canada and Louisiana. It's that piece of territory that's going to concern us moving forward. We're going to be talking about King William's War in North America. But first, before we get to that, we are going to talk about the colonization of North America. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. I'd like to thank everybody who has helped to support the show, everybody who has signed up to become a patron on Patreon, and there have been a ton of you this week. I really appreciate that. Everybody who has signed up to support the show through the website or the PayPal. And we're actually revamping the website right now, so hopefully we'll be able to make that easier in the future. Everybody out there who has recommended this show to your friends and family helped us to get the word out, and everybody who has done something as simple as leave a rating for the show. All of you make this possible. Thank you. Our theme music was, as always, The Old Captain by the fantastic band Brillig. I know you've checked them out. I've seen the YouTube page of their video. So why not go and give them a like on YouTube or a follow on Facebook or go buy one of their albums. They're fantastic and they deserve it, and I really appreciate them letting me use their song. After you're done doing all of that, you can always find us at our website, piratehistorypodcast.com, as well as on Twitter, SoundCloud, Reddit, or YouTube. As always, and most importantly, thank you for listening.